the Friends of the Beautiful discussions completely rock. That one y'all just did with Clayton was fantastic. I had way too many notes.
I know. I was so pissed, and he was just saying amazing things, making great points, and I really like the Substack. Great Substack. Lot to think about. Lot to figure out with it. I think this heuristic of storytelling is really untapped, and there's a lot of mysteries on how to how to quantify and judge in real time whether what's happening in your life is a good story. Very hard, but I think there's a lot of potential there. Um, and I was thinking about also how when you say something's a good story, it's like what's deeply implied is this is going to be a memory. This is going to be remembered, like in your life personally, or um. Oh my God, I'm cleaning. I'm cleaning a room with bleach, and it's burning my eyes.
Oh yeah, totally. Don't die, Luber.
Yeah, uh, I figured you might be able to relate. But yeah, I think it's just really interesting that the heuristic of storytelling, how that just touches on so many different important dimensions all at once. There's so much packed into it, and that's part of I think the problem of diagnosing how it's a good story in real time. Um, and I also think, in terms of the beautiful, I think, when you tell your friends, do it for the plot, as we might talk about it, that might be more digestible than, you know, do it because it's beautiful, which I resonate with. But I'm just trying to think of the modern ear, the average person's ear. And I think they get at the same thing, perhaps. Um, so yeah, I'm just thinking about some of that stuff. I'll pass it back.
Beautiful. I'll throw it straight to Jockin here. I mean, just as quickly. I mean, first, I think that's a very good question. Like, well, it just makes me think of what makes a thing a memory. Like, what makes it have that vividness? Like, what makes it have that quality? As perhaps that is tied to the question of what is a story, or what is a good story, or what is the beautiful. I think that's very, very nice. I was also realizing that talk the desperate need to better define the differences between scale and spread, which I will hopefully do because I think that's really, really important. And I just also just want to say how much I have enjoyed all five of the conversations. They're fantastic. But let me throw it to Mr. Jockin.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. I was like, what a great opportunity. Because I feel like actual relation to memory is because attention, my biggest, not necessarily tension with Clayton's essay, but an area I wanted him to explore more was the idea of wholeness and scale. So he's using a very, it is very Neoplatonic, his model in the essay, in the sense that the scale, the structure is the same all the way up the scale. It's very like Plato's Republic mode, right? That the soul is like the city because there's a one-to-one correspondence. Now, the tension with that is as things scale, their structure and forms totally change. So they're actually radically other. So that's one of the great tensions. And there's lots of examples of it. I mean, one of my favorite examples of it is grasshoppers and locusts. They are the same, but with a difference. And the difference is, it's very fascinating. Did you know it's because it's a hormonal response from crowdedness of basically when the grasshoppers rub up, when there's too many of them in one close area, they rub up against each other. And the response of being too closely packed in together and direct contact with one another releases serotonin in the body, which then causes the epigenetic properties of transforming into locusts. So the gregariousness, very literally thumanic, carried away, almost a Bacillanian kind of frenzy occurs, right? Where they become now this, from harmless little grasshoppers when there's only a certain number of them in a square radius, to now a swarm with radically new behavioral properties, let alone physicality wise. I think so. That's an example. So I'm bringing up this to say that magnitude, increasing of quantity or largeness and scale do introduce otherness radically. That it is the danger of a one-to-one modeling of different orders of scale could leave you blindsided from that property of nature in reality. But that's the reason why, to be charitable to Clayton about it, I was talking through with them about spread. And I think things like memory would probably be one of those heuristical points about it, because that's the whole point now, isn't it? That memory is something that can be abided and participated in by many people at once in a way that seems different from the kind of logic of a quantity scaling increase vertically. It's more of a lateral versus a vertical, if I think of it that way. But yeah, I'll pass it to you, Daniel, because that's the point I would like to know. It's like I was quoting you from my readings of you from Belonging Again, but I realized I'm a little vague on the distinction because I don't think you talk about it so systematically there. So I think I'm sure that's more the answer of on the address rather than an explanation of it. I'll leave it back to you.
No, it's an excellent question. I will dive on the difference between spread and scale, which is big for me. I think the first thing I'll say, but I'll give it to Luber before going more into it before I go on for 30 minutes or something. But I think the point you're getting at on how at a certain quantity, crickets become locusts, they get a different quality. This is very, very important, is that certain magnitudes change behavior. And basically, to start, the problem with scaling is that it changes human behavior to not be able to take into account particularity. And if there are certain modes of engagement that require a deep connection with particularity and difference that is lost at scale, then there are certain behaviors that cannot be taken account of, which may be essential to human flourishing. And of course, I believe there are said behaviors that are lost at scale that are necessary for human flourishing. And you see, that becomes kind of the issue. So the question becomes, what would it mean to spread, which would have an increase of quantity, but not necessarily change the behavior by which people interact in a manner where very important information is lost or unintended consequences arise. Black swans, the unpredictable, et cetera, so forth. But there, of course, is forms of complexity with larger numbers that enable emergent behavior that could be positive. But there's something about scaling, interesting enough, that doesn't seem to... Scaling generates at larger numbers different behavior than large numbers acquired by spread. And that kind of gets into a lot of different things. But before I go into better detail, let me give it to Luber here. Mr. Luber, please.
I have a question for you, but I mean, I'll just say some of my thoughts to preface the question because it's going to clarify something for me. So part of me is like, okay, like going back to our talks on like storytelling democracy and like kind of revisiting that. It's almost like a premise to my potential answer here is the more ontologically primordial the concept is, the more it's able, or is it the more primordial, the more the concept's like ontologically more primordial, it's actually less about scale and it's more about the individual's individuality, subjectivity, however you want to frame it. So basically the question, the thought that I'm having is whenever I get to think about scale, it's like, okay, I'm starting to not really think about specific stories and more about theme itself, which is like a slightly different inquiry, though a theme needs a story, so it does get a little tricky. But so, okay, my question about spread and scale is, is the move that we need to spread more versus think in terms of scale? Because is thinking in terms of scale almost like counterproductive, and that's why you made the distinction between spread and scale? If so, like my urge when I'm thinking about what's the beautiful in terms of politics and friendship and all that, and me thinking about, okay, well, it has to do with theme. Like I have to think about the thematic nature of it all more versus the particular concept of the story. Does the scale imply like a particular, like you having to think about laws about the particular content of a story, and spread is more like laws thinking about the thematic nature of the spread, something like that. So yeah, I just wanted to understand the difference between spread and scale a bit more, and then I kind of want to just elaborate on shifting the focus from the story itself to the theme itself, and that being a potential pathway. But again, that's all contingent on, you know, what you mean by scale versus spread, and also the relationship between getting at something more, uh, actualizing a primordial concept having to do with the distinction between spread and scale. Because the idea is like, oh, well, you're thinking thematically, which just means you're trying to think what's first ontologically. You might not be able to, you might be able to think what's first for your time ontologically, and it might change what's like the primordial ontological status might change, like because your finite position in the world will change, the world changes. So I just, yeah. Theme being that, okay, whatever's first, essentially, and that being how we either do spread or scale, essentially.
Magnificent. Very quickly, the difference between scale and spread, it is a question of the particular qualities of the encounter afforded in scale versus spread, because in scale, the quality of it's not about the individual expression of a given point or node or person, but the quality of the encounter in which we could say the theme emerges. And that at scale, the kind of way that people encounter one another, you could even say the metaxis, the between space, is very different than the between space that is more particular. But it's not so much about the particular expression, because that can actually be, well, power and kind of dominating, but it's about the surprise of the encounter, and that the quality of the encounter changes between scale and spread. And so it's going to be something more primordial, but it's going to also then be about subjects who have been formed by that quality of encounter, who then the average person they meet beyond their immediacy has also been so formed, which then gives rise to a different possible quality of encounter, on and on and on. And that's how you start getting something similar and different that doesn't ignore pluralism or things like that. Now, let me say a little more. So my thinking on scale probably goes back, I don't know, 2010, maybe somewhere around that. Really looking, obviously, kind of starting with, you could say, command economies, Friedrich Hayek, the problem of coordinating large amounts of information in a society from a command economy. And we've talked about this 1,000 times, but basically Hayek's idea is that 99% of what makes a civilization is accidental knowledge or particular knowledge, knowledge that can only be known by people in the situation. You only know how many plastic forks the McDonald's on Ward's Road in Lynchburg, Virginia needs to order if you work there. You could have 20 PhDs, and if you live in Washington, D.C., you can't really know that. And in order to know that, it's going to require totalitarianism, surveillance, tyranny, and it's not going to be good, right? So Hayek is kind of like, the system is really dependent on the free market, ultimately, where people can just organically coordinate themselves, right? And you can look at the free market as, ideally for the Austrian, something that spreads more than scales, actually. And the reason for that is because there's no center command coordination, right? Like, there's millions upon millions of people who can interact, who can carry out their own decisions, do their own things, and have no idea whatsoever how their behavior is going to open the future. It may impact other people. And yet, all of these millions of people in their particularity making decisions overall emerges to the best outcome, or an outcome that is far better than a command economist. And you could see that Hayek is a thinker who is critiquing the possibility of scale, because a command economy can be seen as scale, or when the state runs everything. And the free market is going to be something more that is spreading. Now, of course, the arguments against the free market, it is almost inevitably is crowded out by the state, regulatories, K Street, people get in bed, so on and so forth. So it starts here. Now, the next book on it that gets me thinking is Leopard Coe's Breakdown of Nations. And the argument that he wants to make in that book, and Ivan Illich really like Leopard Coe, is the idea that we often think the problem is either left or right. If you're a liberal, you say, oh, the problem is conservatism. If you're a conservatism, you say the problem is liberals. But what Coe wants to say is that every possible ideology at a certain size, when it becomes too big, becomes corrupted. Like there's no ideology that at a certain size does not break down, actually. So instead of just left, right, he wants us to think up, down. And I was very sympathetic to that argument. And furthermore, novels like All the King's Men, and I can keep going, there's this idea that as a system scales, and obviously vertical, Tower of Babel, however you want to put it, then it becomes more the case that humans make their systems and then our systems make us. Like the way people behave changes as they go higher and higher up the scale. Their behavior, their desires, their subjectivity, it transforms. And there's something about that subjectivity that compresses, it reduces what a person can think. You can think the professional managerial class. You can think the hollow man of T.S. Eliot. You can think Kafka. You can think these kind of people that feel like they're in a certain sort of structure. And it becomes like game theory, where maybe everyone knows that this bill isn't going to work, and yet nevertheless everyone votes for it because the other guy's going to, and no one feels like they're in control, that the kind of the system is running the thing. I think the best Marxist thinkers like Lukács, value form Marxism is always concerned about how capitalist systems change our thinking. And the argument of someone like Lukács is that the tendency towards scale, of which changes people's behavior, is actually embedded in rationality itself. That rationality itself, as a self-relating, like onto its own devices, where rationality is thinking and abstraction, has a tendency toward totalization that wants to include all phenomenon within it. And that is a logic of scale, and it's actually embedded in the logic of rationality, autonomous rationality, and also autonomous quantification, that if not checked by something, will ultimately consume the entire world and compress its logic to just basically utilitarianism. You could say that it's simplistic, but it's not wrong, that the larger a system is, the more it tends toward utilitarianism or pragmatism or things like that. And that tendency is in rationality itself. And I would argue it's in rationality without acknowledgement of something non-rational. You have to, and that's where the Scottish Enlightenment was warning that if rationality was not forced to acknowledge common life, it would become totalizing. And David Hume warns about the coming of total war that was going to be fought for philosophical principles like justice or freedom, not to gain land or to gain food. Because if you're fighting, because without philosophical principles like freedom, if I wanted to convince people to fight in my war, I had to convince them they would gain something from the war, like food or shelter or land. But if I have philosophy that is unbound philosophy, unbound rationality, I can just tell them we're fighting for the king, or we're fighting for Christianity, we're fighting for freedom. And that includes everyone. So now you have the possibility of total war or world war. And that was something that was really concerning of the Scottish Enlightenment. You could arguably say the theme of the Scottish Enlightenment and the counter-enlightenment more broadly was the idea that rationality naturally sought a state where it didn't have to refer to anything concrete outside of itself and thus would become a tyranny. And the logic of scale is a continuation of the logic of unbound rationality, which is also ultimately, according to Marx and other thinkers, Nick Land, the logic of capital. That capital is an unbound autonomous rationality. But this is where things get interesting, because also capital is what makes possible the pricing mechanism of Hayek, without which you have tyranny. Oh, we have a problem. Now I'm going to pause before I explain spread, and I'll give it to Luber on his question. But here's the tension point. So all of these people are telling you that abstract reasoning can turn into basically totalitarianism, and totalitarianism distinct from authoritarianism in the Hannah Arendt sense, like this totalizing vision of reality, which is it's broader than just authoritarianism. All of them are warning that abstraction has that tendency, and furthermore, the larger the system, here's the other key move: the larger the system, the more the most rational people would prevail, because it didn't have to refer to anything in its immediacy. If it has to refer to something in its immediacy, the most rational people will not necessarily win. It could be the blacksmith who is better, or it could be the farmer who's able to work the land better, right? So there's a tendency for autonomous rationality to seek a castle, a tower, a place to rule over everything, because that's where it wins almost by definition, because it only has to justify its action according to its own imminent internal consistency, of which any smart people can come up with a quote-unquote internally consistent system to pull it off. And then if you have to enter the tower to challenge the internal consistent system, then you have to enter into its domain to challenge it, and it wins by definition. So there is always an incentive for autonomous rationality to seek something at scale by which to establish total power. And the issue that we have is that capitalism, of which gives us the pricing mechanism, which gives us the resources for the great enrichment, without which we would still be, quality of life would be very low without the great enrichment. The very capitalism that gave us these things, and the complexity, coordination of the pricing mechanism, simultaneously trains the average person into an orientation for a mode of reality that is more interested in how it can be quantified, what is its practical use, versus the fullness of its being coming forth, to think like a capitalist, of which prones you to be susceptible to totalitarianism. So how in the world do you get the goods of abstract reasoning, the good of capital, the good potential of this system, without it turning into the totalizing of scale? And that's where, for me, it has to be dialectically met with spread, because it's not the case that scale is inherently bad, no more than rationality is inherently bad, no more than quantity is inherently bad. It's when it is autonomous, when it no longer has to refer to anything outside of itself, and that's when you can get some of the auto-cannibalism or self-effacing logic. Now, before I start talking about what makes spread, for me, qualitatively different, and why our age right now, I think, is uniquely able to succeed in spread, which for most of history had to, by definition, be local and bound to Dunbar numbers and things like that. We now have the possibility of a global spread, which means you can have local dynamics at a global scale, which has never before been possible because there wasn't a social coordination mechanism. I will give it to Luber and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. Luber, please.
Okay, so like that makes sense. So like spread is just it's like the other side of the coin, basically. So you need to work with both. And then like for me, it's like, how do you dialectically mediate those actually? Right. So then that's when it's something like theme would make sense, I think, because it's that is what mediates the figures, basically. That mediates those elements, but because but then I get back, it's like, what is the theme? Because it's like you don't know all of the stakes. So it's like, for you to mediate something like that's so, you mediate that dialectic, you have to mediate it through understanding the stakes. So the question is, how do you mediate the spread and scale dialectic without knowing the whole stakes? Like, you could project the stakes where it's like life or death, where it's like but then there's things like, well, the AI causer, where it's like, that there's stakes, that there is stakes, because the causer kind of like reared its head and it revealed one side of those stakes definitively. But like that other side of the stakes, you can't know until the end of the story. But you could project and anticipate those stakes. But the question, I guess, is like how to project that maybe project's not the right word, but how do you project that in such a way that it appropriately mediates that dialectic that you're talking about? And then this is I think very Heideggerian, because it's like the reference to the dialectic is basically Dasein. But it's just such a totally different domain. Like what keeps happening, like I was talking to Jockin and Javier, like it's like we're talking about one thing and I keep trying to relate it to other domains, like aesthetics and virtue, for example. Like I keep, or Hegel's thought and movement, like the movement of thought, and me thinking about, oh, well, the movement of thought has to be isomorphic to character change. But yet, like how you might approach those particular inquiries might be radically different. So yeah, it's like, how do you approach the stakes here in a way that it helps you mediate? Because I understand like the principle, or again, maybe the principle is not the right word, but the non-rationality principle, right? But like that, it's like it's not systematic enough, or maybe I just need to keep reading because you wrote so freaking much. Like it's going to have to be systematic in some way, but the issue with this kind of systematic is that you can't know, there's this unknown variable in it because you can't know the whole stakes. Yeah.
There's a lot to say. I'll give it to Jockin. So the market basically deals with this problem of quote unquote, this mediation, this kind of testing, like how do you figure out the kind of dialectical balance between like scale and spread that you're pointing out? Like, so the market deals with a lot of problems in terms of competition, right? Like we're going to have different products that are going to compete, and we're going to see which one is able to deal with the end, right? Now, what's very interesting is that the standard by which you can tell like which hammer is the best is, which is able to nail the nail in the board best, right? And you go through the different products and you find the one you say, it's good to go. Now, the issue here, what's interesting, therefore, is the standard by which you identify which of the possible options by which you should purchase is kind of given to you by your world and the problems you are thrown into, right? Like, okay, I need a house, therefore I need to build one, therefore I need a hammer. And then there are different hammers that are competing, and you kind of have to determine which one that you need, right? So the end that has to remain open, because it can't be known ahead of time, is arguably going to be something environmental. It's going to be something in, you could say, being in the world that we find ourselves faced with that we can't know ahead of time, and that our fittedness or ability to address that thing is going to be by which we can kind of determine, what best aligns with the theme, what best aligns at the other end of things that can't be predicted ahead of time. So there's something about competition. Now, the argument is a competition, which of course then gets into encounter, surprise, stuff like that. And the question then becomes, what is the environment that we now have to, in a certain sense, be, you could almost say, naturally selected for, meta-naturally selected for? Like, what exactly is the environment? And the environment is something to do with global pluralism. And furthermore, one of the problems, so for this kind of mean between scale and spread, one of the great problems, I would argue, is because of regulatory limitations, cultural limitations, stuff like that, we don't actually have sufficient competition between scale and spread. And as a result, we are struggling to tell what spread is good, what spread is actually, say, enabling a subjectivity that is advantageous or fitting, and we also struggle to know what scale is too much scale to avoid cancerous dynamics, or the point where the crickets become locusts. So there's a lack of competition. This gets into our love of Ivan Illich, the convivial renaissance, where we actually think there are various policies that can be passed, from the median condition of the classroom to the removal of the monopoly of credentials to the replacement of the resume with the portfolio, that can actually help with the competition between scale and spread. So right now, one of the great problems is a lot of the stuff that you're actually describing is tied to a lack of the system affording basically various forms of certain competitions between scale and spread, by which the correct fittedness can be determined. And that gets into the topic of quote unquote word spread, that gets into free speech, that gets into a bunch of different things. But the thing I just want to pause on, and I still haven't really gone into detail on what makes spread qualitatively different from scale, but I will. But the thing to pause on is this idea that there has to be something that is, in a sense, systemized regarding the non-rational, but without knowing the end. You have to have something systematic in a way without knowing the end. And of course, the book will also talk about the difference between system and planning, and also just kind of negotiation on below Dunbar numbers, and somewhere in book 2.1. But like you say, it's somewhere in there. Somewhere in there. I don't know. But there's a question on what exactly is the environment that we are going to actually be able, according to which, to somewhat systemize something non-rational. Because the issue is, like, I guess the point you're pointing at, that is exactly right. All the counter-enlightenment and Scottish enlightenment people say, without something non-rational, that's my language, but and all the post-liberal people are saying this too. You're seeing this movement of post-liberalism rise up on the internet. Pillman, you could say Dugan, all these cats. They're like, yep, without something non-rational, the local religion, something, we all eat ourselves. 100% correct. But if that's the case, they're all going to look at me and basically say a non-local non-rationality is impossible. You can't do it. It has to be embedded in a common life. So you're talking about some sort of in common life on a global scale. What is that? And also, too, the identity does indeed have to be grounded in the concrete, and yet have something in common with all concretely grounded global identities that, because of that in commonness, when they encounter one another, surprisingly, are able to have a quality of that encounter that affords a harmony, not an erasing, not a sameness, but a harmony that is somehow thematically isomorphic relative to some environment that is determining fittedness. Now we have to get into that, but I'm going to stop, and I'm going to throw it to Mr. Jockin.
Well, yeah, I mean, to build on what you're saying, I'm reminding me, and I talk about this in the beauty course I just had, Parallax. Like, the final conclusional point about it was, ultimately, moderns, we have a modular thought of operation versus what Christopher Alexander tells us, a pattern language or pattern mode. And that's actually on that distinction. Modularity does not require any consideration of externality. The contact point at the edge does not matter. The modular, because you could just stamp on the modular interchangeably. Has fungibility, interpretability, etc. Has all these great features. Has a very effective. Has a lot of great features, but the problem with modularity is it obliterates and removes the other, right? And all these other operations you're talking about, or the natural consequence of it. And the distinction to that would be pattern language, which is aware. It is aware of the contact point of the edge, in terms of whatever unit this object is usually a good heuristical point is, whatever object you're interfacing with, whatever the intervention of the object is as of concern, it's always one order of magnitude aware of the next level ahead of it. Meaning your house is aware of the landscape around it. Your landscape is aware of the neighborhood or the larger area. Your body is aware of the space in the room. Your clothing is aware of on the body, right, in relationship to the room. You see, so what it does is, pattern language or pattern modality of thought always has this second, or at minimum, a second order relationship to the end, and considers those interactions. But that's really messy, and that's incredibly complicated. And the whole point of modular thought is, none of this is complicated. Why do you got to do this modular? Why do you got to be all complicated? Just stamp it out, treat it as a given, remove it as an independent variable. Don't worry about it, and just focus on one thing. And that's what we're going to operate on. It has other aspects too, because typically you can get away with it when things are, in terms of fungibility or interchangeability, is because there's commutability. You can introvert. A is to B and B is to A. Or really, quite frankly, what that means is A is B. right? In that, or really A is A. They kind of use that more Hegelian mode of language, right? But what this kind of pattern mode of thought is pointing out is way more. Oh, your grasshoppers under certain conditions or relationships no longer become grasshoppers. Now they're locus. That's A is B mode to kind of use a Hegelian reference point to think about it. So that's just a kind of drawing out of why moderns have a really hard time thinking about this, is because we want interchangeable, interpretable, fungible exchange, which modular thought gives us. Modular patterns, modular operations give us. But pattern operations don't do that. That was because they will always respond to at least a second order complexity that they were responding to or relating to. So that leads to, and that's actually why all this discussion of top-down totalitarianism is all based on that logic. It's not. It doesn't want to consider the complexities at the edges. It wants to stamp them out. Wants to wipe them out. That's why I think this line of these lines from Hume about the inevitability of total war based on idealism. Actually, we did talk about that too. Well, because there was a charge that because Socrates is in the hunt, in the inquiry of courage and justice. He's looking for what these virtues are. It would seem like I was asked of me, is he not going for these operations of the ideal, of this conceptual ideals, abstractions? But then I point out, I address like, that's not really what Socrates is doing. First of all, one, he's actually showing that he's doing this, usually in those early dialogues especially, he's using Elenchus with common life examples, which he gets ridiculed for. They go, what is this stuff? Why are these pots and cooks and pans and bakers and doctors and all this minutia that doesn't matter to the high things of what one is ought to think about? Why using those examples to dismiss my claims of what justice is or piety or etc.? He's mocked for, by the way, and that's in multiple dialogues that talked about it. Gorgias is mentioned. It's actually mentioned by Alcibiades as a whole point is like actually the most common of this man who is lowly and he's speaking with such mundane things is actually magnificence of beauty in this man. He's an algama. This man is the algama. I use the image of the algama that draw this out. This is an algama that breaks open and the gods show forth in the images of virtue in radiant beauty. So this is to say that the common day life of the modality of thinking about it just doesn't make any sense for anyone from a modular point of view. And the whole issue with what Socrates is doing is, first of all, one, his own life is an example of the beautiful. He's an image of it. He actually is the image of the beautiful because he lives a life, and that also buys his example of courage, fortitude, all these. And then actually, I drew the biggest point was that look at Credo. I think it's really interesting, Credo, because that's the one you can most charge him, where he seems to be doing something irrational. Like, why is he has the choice. It's right there. Credo paid the guards off. He's got the shot. He can get out. He can bail. And there is no modern today. Every modern looks at that dialogue and goes, well, he's an idiot. Well, he's dumb. Because obviously the smart thing to do is to get out of there. But how interesting the answer is. And Socrates says, hey, listen, Credo, I get your points. But if you could persuade me that this is really the right thing to do, then I will agree with this and I will go with you. And let's have that discussion, shall we? And then he says, and then what I bring this up to show, I talk about this to say, but notice what the actual push comes to shove of what the principle that Socrates is honoring when he does this decision. It's not an abstract concept. He personifies the law. And he's accosted and rebuked by the law by even proposing this question. I find that really interesting because that's the point. Like Socrates, even in his operation of discussion about the ethical dilemma of do you escape or do you stay to pay the price to do this, to have this act done to you wrongly, knowingly it's wrong. That's the thing. No one disagrees. It was not right that he's being put to death. It's in the form of a person. It's personified. So it's like the opposite of an abstraction. Just saying, in terms of like, why is a person being used to personify the law? I just found that the choice of Plato to have that presented in Socrates really interesting. I'll stop with that.
No, magnificent. And Thomas Winn, divine to see you, sir. You should be very proud of that paper, sir. I finished it last night on Vatimo. I really enjoyed it. And I think that idea of really like seeing the very way, like each historical moment, the way that kind of being presents itself, that can actually be negated, but just letting be that failure that's kind of coming forth and actually kind of witnessing, I think that is very, very powerful. And I think you beautifully wrote that. So thank you for sharing that with me. And I hope you are doing well on this fine day.
Yeah, good. Really very happy to be here.
Divine.
Life circumstances are moving and changing, but I miss this space actually, you know. I said to my partner, I was like, tonight's the night. I'm gonna think a bit. It's been a while since I've been thinking, so I was like, I need to think. And this is the space to do it. So I'm very happy to be here.
Divine. Well, we're honored to have you. Wonderful to see you, sir. And Aspasia, great to see you today. And I'll throw it to Mr. Sartori. All of that was fantastic, Mr. Jockin. We were just mentioning, we were just talking at the beginning on the distinction that I'll sometimes bring up between scale and spread, and how the very way the human being or the subject acts within a system that scales is different from one that spreads. But there's kind of an idea of, well, what is that difference? What are the stakes and so on and so forth. So we were mentioning that. And then I also brought up my beloved Hume. And then in response to what you were saying there, just Mr. Jockin, no, that I completely agree with all of that. And again, the key is that David Hume stresses he is not saying that philosophy is, you know, you don't want anything to do with it. It always has to be brought back to common life as a binding principle, because otherwise it has this tendency to become self-relating, totalizing, and very problematic. So when, again, I would just strongly argue that when he's trying to say you can't get an ought from an is, he's trying to say that you get an ought from basically a suchness. Like you get the ought from the particular cat by the bar, not the vague general category of cat. Say what cats ought to have, because that's going to lead to tyranny. But he's also critiquing. He's very concerned about this new form of science based on natural laws and Newton and all of that, that basically says you can know how the world works from any point. And he just sees that as a license of power to take over, because I can be in Washington, D.C., and I know the natural laws, so I can tell you what Lynchburg, Virginia needs and those people need, because I'm able to actually I'm able to have knowledge without participation. You could really say, in a certain way, counter-Enlightenment thinkers, Scottish Enlightenment thinkers are very, very concerned about human beings believing they can have knowledge without participation. And of course, there's something to be said about science. He's not anti-science, but basically you can say he has a distinction between bad philosophy, bad economics, good economics. And the good form is always the embedded form. But here's the billion-dollar problem, as we've talked about before. Okay, so rationality needs a binding principle. That binding principle is always going to be in your immediacy and local. Well, how does that, and thus the non-rational always has some sort of in your locality, in your immediacy. Well, how does that not lead to tribalism, confederacy, civil war, nations that have nothing to do with one another? So in order to keep rationality from becoming totalizing, you run the risk of creating the conditions of fascism, honestly, or running the risk of creating the conditions where you're too fragile to handle the interaction with otherness. So how does Hume, in my opinion, the very valid critique of autonomous rationality has to survive the charge of not basically creating rationalities that are ultimately just setting up a geopolitical disaster. And that's where we get into, and you could say the modern world, you could definitely say, hey, this is my claim. The modern world said, we can't answer that. And going back to the 18th century, we had no idea how to spread, I would call that the social. We can't spread the social globally without war. So we're going to spread the logic of capital. That will be the quantity that binds all difference. We chose capital, and it went really well, you could argue, for quite a while. And then now you're basically at the end of exhausting that, and we have to somehow regain the social, which means you're able to have global connection that maintains local dynamics, the cosmolocal, as perhaps a Michelle Bowens would say. Well, what the frick? How do you do that? That becomes an infrastructure question. The social coordination, we haven't had this technology to do that, so it wasn't possible until now. That's my argument. So I basically am arguing, and I still haven't gone into detail on the differences between the qualities of spread and the qualities of scale. I will, but I'll give it to Mr. Sartori, and then anyone else who wants to speak on this fine day. I want to make very clear that basically I don't think spread was actually possible in the way I mean it until like 15 years ago. So spread has always basically been, at best, Dunbar numbers, like, the state of Virginia, the state of North Carolina. Spread has been at best nation states, and you could argue nation states are too big. So they've been county or churches or something. Michael, great to see you, right? It has not been, and I will stress this as well. There is a very real sense in which scale was not a quote unquote mistake until now, because there wasn't the realistic option of spread until now. And of course, the fear of error is the fear of truth. Like, you have to encounter the limit, like in the phenomenology of spirit, you have to encounter the limits of scale to actually bring the world together successfully. And you have to go through like 20 or 30 years where you say, well, now we're compressing subjectivity to be unable to handle difference. Like, that was a necessary error in order to realize the political revolution. So it's always in Hegel, it's always a mistake that you had to make. It's only a mistake if you don't sublate it. It's only a mistake if you don't acknowledge the problem and then try to emphasize scale to be in competition, quote unquote, with to have spread in competition with scale to actually figure out the right proportions of both and forms. But that binding of the rational to the immediate, that is, and again, when I'm looking at the post-liberal thinkers, a lot of them coming out of Europe or parts of America, the Philip guy, basically saying that the project of modernity, binding everyone to a compressible quantity so that we can relate globally, is not working and has failed. I 100% agree. But then their option is basically counter-enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment thinking, which I'm all about. But it does, unfortunately, not overcome the problem of creating the conditions of fascism. So, and that's just the case. What does it mean to acknowledge the successes of liberalism and to acknowledge those, and also the correct points of post-liberalism? And you see, we always, in these conversations, there will be a moment where somebody asks the post-liberal, well, are you saying that modernity was a mistake? And they'll say something like this: no, the technologies are great, women's rights, voting, those are all great, but I'm just saying there are problems. Okay, well, how are you going to address this, right? Like, how are you going to keep the good without the bad, right? And then it kind of slips away, right? Well, that's because you need an infrastructure to coordinate people differently so they can interact globally, but from within a locality that can actually bind the rationality or their thinking. And then the last thing I guess I'll say, and I'll give it to Mr. Satori, is part of the issue as well is for people like Peter Berger and the sociologists, is that we are all existentialists now. Modernity is marked by, like with technology and global connected, we're all, like, even the average person is in a sense way more philosophical than the average person was 150 years ago. And thus they are primed to be engaging in abstract thought, right? Like they all already are. Well, that means they're primed to make the mistake of totalizing that, like you're saying, Socrates is trying to correct by bringing it down to the stick or the pot, to talk about the former David Hume. And so that means everyone is positioned for philosophical melancholia because they feel disconnected from the world, as David Hume says, and that tends to turn to anger. That's the problem. Philosophical, when you unleash existentialism upon the world, everyone's prone for melancholia, which basically for me, as Hume talked about the meaning crisis before the meaning crisis, and in melancholia, there's two ways people respond to melancholia, basically hikikomoriism or anger. And anger that is then charged with the ability to totalize and go to total war, which is what happened and seems to be happening again. But I'll talk about spreading stuff, but let me give it to Mr. Satori. Mr. Satori, I hope you're doing well today, sir.
Yeah, so the scale and spread thing, it makes me, well, I always think about like how when we come up with solutions, like human solutions, we do tend to kind of start with maybe these, because the problem we're consciously aware of and we're consciously trying to address. We approach it in this rational way. So we fix things with like straight lines. You build a city, let's build it as a grid. And even like if you think about it's interesting how kind of once you get into the scientism, it's all about how we have this strict method, but then, you get to this idea of Darwinism and that everything kind of, evolves naturally. And then it's like, well, why are we using this straight line method to try to understand this thing that has no straight lines? And it's that's kind of like one of those things Nietzsche talked about, kind of anticipating like that evolutionary argument against naturalism. And he had in his own like way of thinking of things that like Apollonian versus Dionysian kind of distinction, which is really very much the same thing, and that Apollonian vision, which is the rational and the straight lines, it is the totalizing vision. And what happens is, well, we don't think about it in Apollonian terms anymore because people stop believing in Apollo, because that was a totalizing vision that crashed out at a certain point. And so that's kind of the pattern that you see happening. So one of the things I keep thinking about, and this is to say, a Christian, a helpful viewpoint, starting from Christian viewpoint, is thinking about like Paul's analogy in 1 Corinthians about the body, and that as he describes it, he's talking about like hands and feet and eyes, and very, very distinct, easy to grasp things. And of course, even then, they knew that bodies were a lot more complex than that. And so certainly you could say, well, he was assuming that like a social, infrastructure is going to be at least as complex as our current understanding of what a human body is like. But, as things go on, our knowledge of how complex that body is, it really just keeps increasing. And I even think it's interesting, because you think about like, you design a city, or you start with your main street and it's a straight line, and you keep building everything in right angles. But then you get to a certain point where you have all these problems with traffic. And, like if you look at more modern cities, or even just the ways that people address those issues over time, they always start to take on like a more and more organic shape that mirrors, like, well, we call them like arteries, because it's mirroring the flow of blood through the body. It's also, what you see in the way that rivers, diverge, and it's how larger systems of roads, if you look like of a map of like the interstates or something, there are these kind of organic shapes because it's interacting with the natural features. And I think that, it's difficult to get that, the difficulty of scale is get, scaling up is figuring out how do we kind of keep, how do we incorporate that organic structure, because straight lines don't scale. So that's why you need to change that more complex mode. But then the spread is that whatever level of complexity you have mastered or you figured out successfully, then to duplicate it. Like, and I think it's kind of interesting, because when people started, when Darwinism comes on the scene, everybody's so interested in that scaling aspect of how does life scale from a single cellular organism to a multiple cellular organism, and much less interested in like, well, how do these current, we're thinking about like predators and prey, but it's like, well, no, really, like, ecosystem is full of like a ton of very complex, different types of creatures and plants and things, and they all do interact in this way, to the point where that ecosystem is its own organizational, structure that, you start applying straight lines to that, and then you're really going to screw that up too. So it's like, it's like the scale and the spread thing is working just fine in nature. It's just humans have a hard time figuring out how to adapt to that. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I think it's, well, this is the other interesting thing, is like, how much of like philosophy was just men doing philosophy and more or less just assuming women were like some kind of inferior thing, and then we kind of got to a thing of like, well, they're equal, so we can't really talk about what's different between men and women because the equality is the most important thing. And like maybe only now are we beginning to wonder about the fact like there are differences between men and women that are not hierarchical. It's just a difference, but you certainly can't flattening that distinction is that problem of applying straight lines. And I do think it's interesting because it's like philosophy didn't address that for a long time. To be addressed stories because stories are about men and women, and you have to get both sets of characters right, or if it's going to be a good story. So like I just keep thinking about these things of like what would a thinker know if they had realized these differences. And what was it? Oh yeah, this other book, The Timeless Way of Building, which is like this more away connection to his pattern language. I remember it's nothing where you could just say like, oh, here's what I'm measuring the dimensions. It's like one of them, I don't remember what the other one was, and then the third one was like a fruit stand on the side of the road that was made of plywood, but there was just something about where it was located and how it was constructed and the dimensions, all these things where he was like, that structure, as simple as it is, cannot improve upon, and it's serving its function like just purpose. And I think that's something that you can, it's beauty that you can apprehend, and at least having some encounter with that, it keeps you from getting trapped in like vision. To be able to say what's good about the fruit stand, like that's the inconvenient thing that the totalizing force is always trying to squash, because it doesn't know what to do with that dissatisfaction, which is connected to a familiarity with something better, something beyond, our best instruments.
No, absolutely. And no, there is some, as for Seth and I just had a lovely talk on male masculinity, female femininity. And there's something definitely about the feminine that can be associated with non-rationality, spread, male scale, autonomous, rationality, which again, if rationality has a tendency toward this autonomousness, there's a problem. And I think definitely there is something about many of the Scottish Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment thinkers were extremely concerned about philosophers who are basically isolated, not married, not part of the society, weren't going to the pub, and therefore had a tendency to basically making what Kierkegaard said, castles in the sky. And of course, he himself arguably had some of that problem, although I like him. But I think also what you're saying on the fruit stand makes me think of Jan Jacobs, The Rise and Decline of Cities, and how many city planners today suck because basically they're not able to think the living world, the living ecosystem, nature, the vines. They're not able to think the value of the fruit stand. I always love that part. She has that chapter in there where she says cities are doomed without old buildings. Like she's like, I can't even imagine the possibility of a city surviving without old buildings. He's like, because old buildings are where the artists live, the culture people, and old buildings are what get changed into these cool pubs that people want to be at. So he said, like, what's killing cities more than anything is a ghost. That's right, Aspasia. What's killing cities are new buildings. Everything has to be new, and it's terrible for the environment. Right. And there's something about rationality that goes toward the straight line, the smooth, the new, the technological, that then leads it to an environment of, well, it scales, but it flattens. And typically scaling tends to flatten. Spread tends to keep dynamic. But the problem is the more dynamic something is, the more difficult it is to make intelligible globally, or it becomes chaos, right? Of course. And I think you are correct that nature does not have a problem of spread. And well, actually, to the issue in West's very important book, and I think this gets at it, he points out that basically nature has natural scaling laws. And this actually ties into what I want to say on the relation between spread and scale, though I'll give it to Luber, Mr. DeClercq, and anyone else who wants to speak on this fine day, is what basically, to say a very fantastic argument simplistically, is that trees don't become as big as the Empire State Building, bees don't become as big as elephants, et cetera, because nature entails natural scaling laws. And it's tied to metabolism, it's tied to the context of the entire environment, whereas humans do not have natural scaling laws because we can imagine and make straight lines and smooth surfaces of which don't naturally scale and thus can become too big, use up too much energy, and become basically destructive. So the point is that you could argue that because nature naturally takes care of spread, it also, this would be my argument, because nature naturally takes care of spread, it also proportions scale properly. The problem is we as human beings, we tend to prioritize scale and therefore don't scale proportionate properly. And that is also, though, tied to the fact that we've never had an effective infrastructure to spread globally without losing information. Now that we have a technology by which we can spread without losing or compressing information as badly, and to coordinate human relationships more effectively without losing information, it is now perhaps possible that the conditions are there by which we can better proportion scale, like nature does, because you need to have effective spreading by which to do that. And I think also, to your point, you could argue that religions have traditionally been well, I think the history of religions is particularly useful to see the dynamics between spread and scale. Because arguably religions that are, you know, you would say, well, wait a minute, hasn't, say, evangelicism spread around the world? You know, what do we mean by scale? Well, you could argue they've done that by taking the entire gospel and turning it into a Roman road, which therefore is actually scaling more than spreading, because you are compressing information and you are creating it to where anyone can get on board. And that that has its advantages, but you could argue leaves out otherness and leads to various problems. Whereas now you could argue many of the religions or forms of Christianity that are becoming more popular have not scaled as effectively, or they're more orthodox, and they have spread, of course, or Catholic, or you could say. They've spread, but notice that they haven't spread as quickly or as effectively as evangelism, right? But that's also an argument by why they've been able to preserve, say, the tradition of sacramental ontology, why they've been able to preserve a certain depth. So what would it mean to effectively have people participate in that depth more globally without losing information? So I think religions are very interesting to actually study on this problem. But I'm going to stop, and I will get into the scale stuff, but give it to Mr. Luber here. Mr. Luber, please.
Yeah, there's a lot to this, obviously. Well, okay, so I think, like, the question of spread. So basically, is the solution only in technology at this point? So if it's not in philosophy, because everybody is existentialist, it's not necessarily a new thought that will. You're making me think it's not a new thought, so to speak, that's going to change anything. It's more, it's more grounded in technology, because technology is actually what created spread. Like, it's almost like scale. With technology, scale won't matter because things will invert back to being local, because no one will need to think in terms of scale anymore because of spread. That's what you're making me think. And in that sense, it's like, when you want to talk about politics, you're not even going to think about politics of like such a universal scale or a societal scale, because the spread in a certain sense suffices everyone's desires with technology, Amazon, et cetera, and so forth. And that the only thing, it's like, okay, things get inverted back to just being local in this way, then the politics would be something like friendship, in the sense of you only deal with with people locally. And like locally could mean like this Zoom, the net could be interpreted as locally. So like locally doesn't mean just, oh, Lynchburg, Virginia. It means local to your circle of friendship, basically, family, etc., so forth. So I definitely think, and then it's almost like the question of the beautiful and the story really only matters once things get inverted to that local level like this, where it's local in this construal that I'm saying. So it's almost like putting the cart before the horse by thinking about, theme, story, beauty, all that stuff, because we're just anticipating something a technological shift in human behavior and modality, and then those type of things are likely to happen. Sorry, I'm just thinking out loud in terms of like it really all comes down to technology in a way, is what you're making me think. But there's something problematic with that at the same time. But it only seems like the problem emerges once the technology implementation already happens. So it's like, it's not a problem yet, but it's like when things are actually understood as local in the way that we're talking about, and spread is, efficient, then it's like, what do you do with that existential life? Because it's a different kind of life at that point. Yeah, that's what you're making me think. So I'm gonna pass it back.
No, all outstanding. And so it's very important. Like right now, you have the ability of people. You could almost talk about, instead of a local, the locals. Like everyone here in their local situation, locally, in their own particular place all around the world, are in a sense able to consistently gather. And this ability of people to interact without, say, traveling, having the, like to have a quote unquote conference like this, that would be a lot of class selection right there, right? In order to have this kind of conversation, there would be, in order to make this kind of gathering possible for most of history, there would be such a radical amount of selection, self-selection, that would have already occurred to do it, that the kind of thinking that could have occurred there was probably contained or limited by the starting constraints of the possibility of the meeting. So this technology changes the possible constraints of that are now, it widens the possibilities of having a gathering like this, and thus widens the possibilities of what can be thought. And that widening of thought thus goes a long way to actually increasing the diversity of the thinking ecosystem of nature, if you will, thus increasing the probability that you actually have complexity versus capture, that you have a thriving, you could say, ecosystem of the mind, right? And there is something about technology. I mean, it's the reason why I call it a social coordination mechanism. Technology is not evil. It's not the problem. It's the technology. It's when technology does your thinking for you. But if it were to facilitate gatherings of people that were able to make possible thoughts that couldn't be had before, well, then it would be extending the human versus replacing it. But let me say a few things. So a key characteristic of scale versus spread is that spread means that if that there's no point of failure that would collapse the whole thing. Whereas scale always means there's a point that theoretically, if it failed, the whole thing could also fail, right? Like there's a center, right? Like in a spread system, there are many centers. Like there are many different, like look at all the YouTube channels, right? Like if one of those fail, it doesn't mean the entire system fails, right? And even if YouTube goes down, the relationships are still there. People can still gather together. They could theoretically create their own video platform, et cetera, so forth, right? So there's this real potential of something growing back, something coming back. Because of that structure, it is extremely possible to imagine that people are more independently forming their own thought and their own character according to their own interest and their own pursuits without asking one another and coordinating with one another. Can we do it? Can we get the money to do it? You don't have to coordinate with a center. Whereas if you wanted to like start a McDonald's franchise, you would have to coordinate with the center. You would have to go through the bureaucrats. You would have to have the money in order to get the permission to do it, right? So there's more of a kind of top-down structure that's going on. But that top-down structure also makes it way easier to have something in common with a lot of people because it's McDonald's. We all know what the McRib is, right? We all know what the hamburger is, or the Whopper at Burger King or something. It gives you a common language, and thus seems to give you, and then in a sense gives you a common culture. But if instead you start trying to have something that's decentralized or something that is spreading, you have to have something in common with people that actually, the thing that is in common is thanks to the difference. And you see, that's very different because most things in common in history were due to basically an erasing of difference, which meant sameness and coordination, right? And we're gonna get everyone on board with knowing what the Whopper is. So you're teaching people a language. You're teaching people a soft power by which they can coordinate, right? Well, in spread, what you're like on the social coordination mechanism, there's something in common that is actually shared because people are doing their own work in their own way, that then when they come together, it creates something in common, or some in common activity. That could be an energy, that could be a feeling, that could be an experience of inspiration, that could be like catching something that then you want to pursue. But that is afforded to everyone equal. That possibility is afforded to everyone equally here because of the differences they bring, and their ability to actually speak. So there's something in common thanks to the difference. And the reason why that's a really big deal is because then the thing in common is not so easily capturable by power. It is not something that can be systemized in a manner that removes difference, and it's actually going to facilitate freedom. But it's harder to put into words. It's harder to quantify. So it has a kind of fleeting character, right? It's something you can say, well, I don't know why we get together. No, I know exactly why we get together. But if I had to explain it would be difficult, right? That kind of ambiguity actually is one of the reasons why you're able to self-organize, why you're able to actually start your own thing, do your own work, and actually be less susceptible to quantification or capture in a bad way, right? But because of that ambiguity of understanding, it is really, really difficult to honestly keep the faith in the work. Like, you know, if you're working, let's say you're on your own philosophical project or short story and you don't have any other artists in the community to talk with, it gets really, really lonely. And if everyone's telling you that you're wasting your time, it's going to be really hard to sustain it. So you likely will give it up, right? But if you're able to find, 20 other people in your community, which in the past was more likely if you lived near a university, it was likely you would find that because universities were kind of a key coordinating mechanism. Well, then you might have at it. But now you're able to find, say, 30 people online, and that makes a really, really big difference. So again, like spread is going to be tied to the ability of people to be engaged in a shared work. I mean, another way you can kind of look at it is that there's no single point that has to do all of the coordination of everything else, right? That everyone, like someone could vanish from YouTube and come back 3 years later and it's actually still growing, right? Like that's a key characteristic of a forest, right? Like if a tree falls down or a tree goes away, the forest keeps growing, right? That it's still alive, that it's still kind of happening. That's a really big deal, but that was extremely difficult. There is a certain suggestion that technology is actually necessary for what I'm describing. Now, again, I don't want to say that like when I said earlier that I really don't believe spread in this global, local way that I'm describing was possible until the social coordination mechanism. I am not saying that there hasn't been any spread at all. I am saying that it tended to be more local. And in the example of religion, It spread by having a shared dogma or beliefs, but that ran into the problem of pluralism. There has not been, so let's put it this way, there has not been a form of spread that was actually thanks to and facilitated by pluralism versus pluralism be a problem. So the question then becomes, okay, that's nice and all, Dan, but then what is the environment that this unique spread of a certain orientation across pluralism, what is the environment selecting for that is open-ended and can't be predicted ahead of time, which I think is going back, that is more ontologically primal, that primary, versus just individual expression that we can handle, and what is being selected for. Now, that is extremely large. There's a lot more to say, but I will stop and give it to Mr. DeClerc, Mr. Jockin, and then Mr. Winn. Mr. DeClerc, please.
Yeah, the image that was coming to mind as you were describing the difference between, well, the two images came to mind when you were talking about how in scaling, if you remove one element, the whole system can topple down, as opposed to in spread, it's a lot more resilient. I thought of the Tower of Babel and how, you're trying to grow something, and I think like trying to grow something vertically as opposed to, horizontally. Like buildings are, yeah, like really vulnerable. They're like seismically vulnerable to, to earthquakes. Like as you're building up, it's like you have to really be mindful of how much that building can hold the weight. But like specifically in the Babel story, like you have this unification across different languages, but like as soon as God makes it impossible for people to communicate with each other, like the whole thing collapses. And I think it's similarly, if you try and in kind of a very authoritative way create like one language across difference, I think that can be very dangerous. I think it can like lead to flattening of multiplicity. It can lead to all sorts of like political correctness that must, be maintained to like maintain the system, like an enforcing of, you talk about like the difference between free speech and freed speech. Like I think that's something that we're seeing in the spirit of unification. It's actually creating more polarity, because what is being oriented, the like orienting principle is not something beautiful, which is like infinitely inexhaustible, right? It's something that is an attempt towards goodness, an attempt towards like a certain guardrail of what's right, and then like activity then becomes a lot more like duty focused and kind of like, and there's like a shame culture around that, as opposed to in spread, it's like people are intrinsically motivated around like principles and ideals, which I think is an important distinction, like values and ideals from law maybe, or from dictation or something. I was actually having a conversation with a friend about that today, talking about in the context of counseling, and like, we're reading like kind of like decolonializing therapy and like trauma work and things like that. And he was kind of like, just worried or just self-conscious of like not perpetuating that, and etc. And I was trying to make the argument that like the kind of third way that I found, as opposed to either just like rejecting that and kind of just being like, oh, like woke or whatever, or just kind of like drinking the Kool-Aid, is to like orient around beauty and love and connection, and trusting that internal come from will actually lead to greater connections across difference and, coalition building, etc. And I think in the online space, especially around like these like formerly university professors who are now teaching classes online, and like I'm a part of a platform like that. And it started with like this professor putting out these classes, which he still does, but now there's like all these other things that have branched off. Like there's a poetry workshop that I am a part of that he's not a part of. Like it was completely organically created by the members, and other book clubs, and other classes, and now guest professors coming, and there's like such a high fidelity whenever one of these groups is created. It's not like there's this fear like, oh, the leader of the helm is not, doesn't have his hand in this pie, like how's it going to be operated? Because there's kind of like an operating come from of openness, curiosity, respect, like a love for learning, a love for like the beautiful, all of those things, that like new people come in and they just immediately trust that that is going to be there, like, and they don't have to know any of these people, like, and I think that's a sign that like something is really spreading, is like you said, like the creator of the thing can step back and new branches of the tree can form, and it still have the same integrity. It still have the same roots, you know. But yeah, I'll pass back there.
No, that's outstanding. And maybe a way to put it, in spread, there is no single point of coordination, and yet there's something in common with all the points, which should kind of be impossible, right? Because we have an issue where if we say there is no single point of coordination, then what's the difference between spread and just, difference, multiplicity, right? Like, what would it mean for something to be spreading that nevertheless maintains difference? Because how can you say anything is spreading? Because isn't it just the encounter with difference, right? Well, there would have to be, like on the example you're giving there's no single point of coordination, right? There's someone who may have started it, and yet all of those different points are different, but they have something in common. And yet the thing they have in common is also weirdly difficult to describe or put into words. You say love of learning? Yeah, that seems to be it, but that's so general. And yet that's a generality that entails this kind of infinite multiplicity. There is definitely something about spread that is complex versus complicated, meaning there are the starting positions, there's shared constraints, limited, like we're about intrinsically motivated learning. Let's just say that intrinsically, all organizations that are every group that is part of this thing that is spreading is unified by intrinsically motivated learning. Those are the kind of starting conditions. They're the constraint. And from that, you just get emergence, all of this unpredictable behavior, right? Whereas there's something about scale that is additive, and everything is being added to the same center to widen the circle, right? It's a single circle that is being widened like a tower, right? And in a scale model, you have a very clear and crisp distinction between center and periphery, you may also say. Like that there's the inner and there's the outer. Spread seems to be working against inner and outer, although you can never totally remove inner and outer. But the question is, to use Bard's language, how do you make it more membranic and therefore more of an environment where things are kind of dancing with one another? There's a certain curve. There's a way that things are working with one another. You will also say one of the reasons why you have to move between scale, there's a wonderful book that I've really enjoyed, The Red Queen Trap by Michu, that the Dark Renaissance people were talking about. And basically all scaling systems eventually run into a Red Queen Trap where the energy expenditure simply to maintain stability is too high, and it can't even do that, and it starts falling apart. Where spread is about avoiding the Red Queen Trap, and many things like that. But there is this $1 million issue where spread means there is no shared coordination, and yet they maintain something in common, and yet that thing in common affords difference, which then how in the world do you make sense of that? And then, of course, the question becomes, what is the overall, I think to Mr. Luber's very important question, what is the primary, like, what is it, the individual expression of each one of those membranes that are primary, or something that is kind of primordial between them that can come up, right? That becomes a big deal, and what is also just kind of the environment that is selecting for one or the other. And I know I keep emphasizing that, but let me stop and give it to Mr. Jockin, to Mr. Winn. Mr. Jockin.
I mean, one of the examples of the spread point is actually on Luber's issue is we only know each other. And then look what happened when we went to Stumping Ground. This is a point in terms of familiarity from people who never met in person. Just as a note, I'm just thinking about that. Now, that's always the tension is, and I think about also an example of what's going on with like even this object, like the net or the Friends of the Beautiful, where it is a group in intimacy, like in a small group that knows each other, but because we publish it in a public surfing face, it has scale because what was made into an intimate closed circle relationship was then presented to a larger group. Just a note, I'm just thinking through that in terms of how to think through what spread versus scale interacts with each other as a note. I think the other thing is, besides this distinction of the modular versus the pattern distinction, besides that one, I think another one, an area I have a lot of interest in, I'm probably going to write more about it later this year, is chirality. It's a whole it's a category of difference that we don't understand. We keep running into it in many different things. In natural sciences, like in chemistry, chirality is the position. It's sameness but difference by position. Left-handedness and right-handedness. Like your hands are technically by a line of symmetry, they are the same, but they're actually radically different. You can't put them one on top of each other. So I say that because in chirality of chemistry, a molecule, the famous example is a medicine that helps cure morning sickness, because they didn't understand, they knew that chirality existed, but they didn't think it mattered. It was nothing. So thus, that chirality, the left-handed ones did cure morning sickness, but the right ones caused birth defects. So now it does have a difference. It actually has a significant difference now, doesn't it? Right? I think there's a lot of, I think actually gender is an example of that. I think gender is chirality. That's actually, I thought more about it over time. I've come to that conclusion. Just on the most basic of point, that on the genitalia point, it is true. It is a chirality inversion. Basically, chirality is not just left and right, it's a little inside and out. In terms of when they do reconstructive surgery for transsexuality, that's what they're doing. They're literally inverting the position of the sex organ. That's what they're doing. That's why I'm actually standing pretty strong about this chirality point, because now that's a very blunt way to talk about it. But it is, because there's a lot more going on there. But that's my point. That we're dealing with it, we encounter it, but we don't have any understanding of it. It's almost like, it's actually another point. I find that generally reality gets ahead of itself, and we're always catching up with it symbolically. I think that's an example of it, where our logic of modality, operations of imposition, can't understand chirality. You can't understand these distinctions of sameness but difference at the same time, and we get caught up in trying to articulate it. I do appreciate, Daniel, your discussion with Espacea and Seth on gender and sexuality and heterosexual and masculine and feminine. I think it's a fair point, and everything we're talking about is totally valid. I don't disagree with anything that's being said there. I think there's a lot of great things being said, but the very fact that we're so at a loss is because there's a whole category we're not understanding. That's one point. Now, how significant that is, it's to be said. I don't know, but I just get suspicious that such a basic point that we do know exists, but yet can't talk about, means something's going on here. Something's getting blocked in our understanding, which I very much have the opinion of the beautiful. We're caught up in the good so much that we can't even see the beautiful. Because the point is, part of what I said about the beautiful, it's always this kind of accidental, because it comes along with, like the word for Greek for accidental is coming along with causation. So we're just caught up with the explicitness of the concreteness of like, this is the cause, and we have a linear mode of thinking about it where it's modular, like it's like wood is wood, and it's the cause of the material because it's wood. You see, it has that kind of per se-ness of account versus what are the things that come along with it Like word of accidental kind of gives us almost a dismissal point, but it actually is very important. There's only secondary effects of the luster of the wood, the texture of the wood, the luminosity of the wood. It actually affects the quality of walking to a room that's made of oak, like oak of 100 years old or more, like a study that has that in the shelving. It's a very different feeling than plywood, very different feeling than plastic, IKEA shelving. You see what I'm saying? Like those are coming along with properties that affects how you feel in the space, but they have a real effect. It's not arbitrary. You see, like so I think that's part of what we talk about with the beautiful is these kind of accidental necessities that by their conditional presentations in front of you bring together a kind of synchronicity of encounter that's more excessive than anything of the particulars that could be accounted for explicitly ahead of time. Or like that's where how freedom relates to beauty in that way too. Because it's already, if it could be prescribed with certainty before the fact, and that's necessity, which is actually, which, by the way, I brought it up in the course. You know, I think people get sort of surprised when we see the Greeks really, necessity was actually the antithesis of the gods. It's very interesting. Basically, because there's a line stated from Agathon about the one thing the gods can't even do. The one thing the gods can't do is they can't undo the past. They can't undo action. Another line, and actually other lines about it related. It's more it's in Phaedrus a little bit, where basically the regime. Oh no, actually, excuse me, it's Alcibiades. Excuse me, actually, from Symposium. Basically, no, actually, it was Agathon. Sorry, it was Agathon talking about it, about the nature of love. He talks about how even the gods were subsumed into the authority of necessity, but out of that regime, because they all love the beautiful. I found that really, again, a really fascinating line. So that's almost kind of draws the point that in beauty that we get freed out of necessity into this accidental contingency, but that actually reveals and counterfactually a new possibility of how things might be, a more radiant quality from what's been captured. Anyways, this is me just riffing at this point, but I find it actually very important because I'm bringing this up because it is absolutely true that friendship can't work. Like part of the tension right now, we're trying to operate with community. That language of community and friendship is trying to cognize it by an operation of modular thought. By an abstractional relationship, we can create well-being and belonging. It cannot do that. We can get meaning from that, but we cannot get belonging. The kind of place. Thus, Daniel, shout out to you. I've been using that language too. I used to talking about it. I think it's very true. If it was a command, hey, Thomas, be friends with Thomas Winn. What? Like as an example, I see him on my screen next to me, but as an example, like it doesn't work that way. You cannot by a force of necessity make someone be friends with someone. It doesn't work that way. So that's why I'm bringing this up. I think that's why friendship and beauty and the relationship to necessity and contingency and accidental coming along with have a very deep relationship with each other. That scale wants to ignore. It doesn't want that. It wants to know with 100% certainty, or as much as humanly possible, how can we get this action to occur consistently and always? That my McDonald's in New York is the same as Pennsylvania, which is the same as Maryland, which is the same as Virginia, etc. Right? You notice like what's going on there. And listen, I like having that trust. I like having that trust where I know, hey, if I go to somewhere in the country or the world, I can go to McDonald's or Chick-fil-A and I know I'm going to get with a very tight boundedness of approximation what I'm going to get from that experience. There's value in that. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But the fact that we've caught up like that is the mode of operation for all existence is what, as you said, Daniel, that totalizing quality where basically we want to make the world into a bunch of paper clips to kind of play with that thought experiment. You can see when you start seeing it that way, you start understanding the legitimacy of that thought experiment, why they're thinking that, even if it sounds funny. Anyways, that's all for me.
No, absolutely magnificent. If you're traveling and know that there's a very high chance that the place you go to will have a Walmart, that does a lot for you because if you run out of diapers, you know where you can go, right? So there's real advantages for having a general sense of what's probably going to be available to you without having to look it up. But then that also means that you're gaining that reliability perhaps by an economic system that crowds out the mom and pop store, right? And so one of the questions become, is like, well, how to get both, of course, right? Like, what would that look like? You said a lot there that was very, very important. Yes, basically we can associate scale with basically necessity, guarantee, because we have no idea, um, like we've tried to deal with globalism through various forms of necessity. Because how else are we going to bring all of the different religions and nationalities together? Asking them nicely, persuading them, but according to what? They have different first principles. They have different values. How am I going to persuade the Chinese and the Americans and the Mexicans, et cetera, and the atheists and the Hindu to get along, right? On what basis would you do it, right? Well, what we tried is money, economy. We will convince them on the effectiveness of capitalism to generate prosperity, right? And then that you could argue that's been a lot of the project with great successes. But then to say something very large, because you hit a growth plateau and you don't know how to continue with non-zero sumness, it falls into zero sumness, and the unity principle becomes deterrence and debt, which we had a lovely talk with Heckle-Menzer on, right? And so that becomes a problem, and that reaches its limits. And so the question now arises, okay, we're all bound together now. We did that whole globalization thing. It worked great for a little bit, but now you've reached the limits, or seemingly, of what you can stimulate demand and not have stagnation. Now you're starting to have stagnation, and let's have the deus ex machina, hopefully, of AI deal with it all, but that brings its own problems. So the question becomes, well, what can be the new basis of bringing people together? Well, that sounds like persuasion, and how are you going to persuade people that are in different moral universes, right? On what basis would you do it? And of course, this gets into our the extremely important topic that you brought up. That's exactly right. Is there's basically no hope of it based in the good. It has to move to the beautiful. There's no chance at all of basically having something in common across all possible worldviews, except that which calls people out of their maps, out of their worldviews, and that would be the strike of beauty. And basically, this would also suggest that what is spreading is basically a condition that absolute necessity, that strike of beauty, where something can occur to people that strikes them, right? So what you're spreading is not a guarantee, but a condition. And the thing that all of the different membranes or groups have is they share this condition, this accidental contingency that affords a certain orientation. That's the other thing. Like, these people have a certain way they are toward the world, or they experience things that then allows the possibility of that strike of beauty, as we put it. And so then the question becomes, how do you spread that? And I think also I just wanted to comment, and then I'll give it to Mr. Winn here, on this idea of the cart before the horse that Mr. Luber brought up on beauty or the technology. For me, there's always this very interesting thing where if you're not talking, if beauty is not there in history to be, if things are not early, they're not there to be recovered. And there's something about the recovery that actually is necessary for the formation of the subject to be of the character that can realize the technology in its fullness when it is then available. And so, like, if there isn't anything that comes early, then there is nothing that can be plugged into or used with the technology when it arrives, so that it can actually be used in the manner that extends humanity versus lead to our replacement. And there is something to be like, there is something also to be said, like this very technology, the social coordination mechanisms, could just be used to make a bunch of neo-Nazi groups, right? Couldn't you just coordinate a bunch of tribal groups that fight one another? Like, how is it going to be used actually to deal with the problem of global pluralism? Well, it needs to be connected with the ideas of the beautiful encounterology and the encounter of different people and all in forgiveness and all of those other topics that we describe. And therefore, there's something about and there's also something about the always alreadiness that is at play. That once you realize these things, you say, oh, that was actually always what the technology was moving to realize. Oh, actually, would you have even bothered with making the technology if there wasn't a lurking sense of a need to create the conditions of the beautiful? So there's this kind of bothness where which comes first and which comes later. I think all gets kind of brought together in a certain gestalt. But I just wanted to note that there is, for me, something important about the technology. As the social coordination mechanism, the technology really plays a role because what it allows is the coordination of localities around the world embedded in their difference to actually encounter one another without, say, everyone living at the same university, coming to the same geographic location, because you need to be able to do this regularly. not just once a year, but regularly. Now, you may have in-person events less regular, but those are also possible and wouldn't have been possible in the past. That is habituating you to a different way of encountering in the world. And that means you meet a different condition that then you might be able to encounter the theme, which otherwise you would not be able to do. But I'm going to stop now. I have not said anything about the environment thing that I mentioned and fittedness and all that. But I will stop and give it to Mr. Winn and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Winn, again, thank you for being here, sir. It's a complete delight to see you.
Brilliant. Oh, my thoughts are definitely thinking. I'm enjoying participating in this a lot, actually. And it's quite useful because I've done what I used to do when I listened to the net, which is actually using a pen and writing stuff down. The first word I wrote was flat, like flattening. I can't remember who was speaking. Was it Michael? And he was using the word flattening a lot, and squashing. So I wrote the words flat through binaries. Again, it comes like to the gender thing, and see the distinction between flat and complex. And it just reminds me of like the key problem that I think arose in like contemporary philosophy, and also in a course I did like 10 years ago on contemporary political philosophy. Like, how do you bring into the shared space of values, like values that we propose as good or bad? How do we propose that value as something universal rather than something particular, something local, something developed through history, compared to something which we can ground as like an absolute fact of like, this is good, this is bad. And it's interesting because now that the PhD is finished, I'm trying to find a job, and all of the jobs are in ethics. And I was like, I remember speaking to my old supervisor, he's like, yeah, you just might as well stop, like, because he doesn't like ethics. But I was like, well, if you read the later Heidegger, I think there's some sort of avenue to think about ethics, actually. And it's been interesting. I've been working a lot outside of academic stuff the last year, but when I do allow myself to make time to read, it's always about this idea of ethics. Like, how do you talk about truth in like a sense of embedded truth, local truth that speaks to like one's own existence, one's own being, whilst also being rigorous enough to be like philosophically absolute. I think that's what we always try to touch upon here when I was speaking before. And it was always interesting with Jockin, Luber, Javier, and the others. Like, how is it that you approach absolute truth as something which could be particular, something which could be always already there, or at least there for conceptualization, that is universal. So then the next question I wrote is there a way to think without the nagging thought that rationality is flattening life, And I think Hegel approaches this problem of like the distinction between thought and being, and how do you reconcile the two? How do you experience truth? And of course, like the people, again, with the PhD, and I've approached them again, like Zizek, Vatimo, so the article I wrote was on Vatimo, saying that there is no absolute truth, everything is like embedded in historicity and everything is an interpretation. But really focusing on the later Heidegger, I think there is definitely an alternative answer. And I think the answer comes from what I've gathered from this is like, how is it that you become capable of spread whilst not capturing the instances of each locality, but maybe, and this is where phenomenology becomes so fundamental for me, it's maybe waiting before the desire to capture the instances of each local place, and instead maybe waiting or encountering, and then just even writing that point there, which I think was from you, Daniel, after someone else spoke. It reminded me of the conversations we had before, like Thomas, beauty, waiting, and the word I think for this conversation for me speaks the most, which enables us to be capable for plurality, for history, for locality, for economics, for interpretations, perhaps, is allowing. So I think allowance is a word, and actually you said there, like, we need to find how technology can allow us to connect in this conversation. How can we allow technology to be okay without dominating us? For example, AI and stuff, and how can we exist together without dominating others? And so letting be, which is always what things still come back to, is for me a word which is basically allowance, because for the later Heidegger, he does drop the word being. He doesn't use being at the end of his life. He talks about Ereignis, which is this appropriate event. Appropriate as in like, it makes sense for us as humans. Like, it is appropriate to us. And for him, it's just that simple experience of allowance. So being, we don't need to determine it, but what is true about life is that it's giving experience of itself to itself, and we as humans simply participate in that giving. And we as humans can allow that giving to give, not in the sense of being passive, but also as being humans that also allow things to come into being. So for Heidegger, in the end of his life, he gets very excited by this concept of we are letters. We let things come into existence. We think, we participate, we allow, we move. And I think all of this conception around letting be relates both, and I wrote freedom and love, but then I think what Thomas said, like beauty, there's something about that experience where you don't have to intervene, which is itself beautiful, but also in my opinion, like ontologically primal. And I'll just read something, because he, in the middle of his life, he calls it releasement. And so I have some notes from a few years ago, where I said, in this newly discovered quality or character of releasement, Heidegger, in the memorial address, points to the actualization of this way of being. He's like, oh, the true way of being, so authentic, ethical, which does not say no to technology according to a kind of letting it go, but nor does it say yes according to holding it on. Heidegger claims that a new comportment to technology appears, quote, which expresses yes and at the same time no, because it's a kind of, quote, releasement towards things. This releasement lets technology be and sees how it can be approached and used and lived with in such a way that technology falls into its place, whereby it becomes, quote, wonderfully simple and relaxed, end quote. This is because, quote, we let technological devices enter our daily life and at the same time leave them outside. That is, let them alone, as things which are nothing absolute but remain dependent upon something higher. So in a way, I see like technology in that sense can be the table, it can be the bridge, it can be the pen, it can be the clothing that we've created, that we've let come into existence. AI is different, of course, because it's kind of autonomous, maybe. It's like something's escaped, like we've allowed it to be, and the question is like, will it allow us to be? But the thing is, I think like technology in that sense is we've created, we've cultivated our current historical moment through our interpretations, through our misguided desire for totalization and domination. We're currently in that epoch where now we have the decision where we can perhaps have technology like a bridge, which allows us to cross the river. And I think in a way, like, it doesn't matter what the current historical horizon is for each culture globally in a globalized world. I do think ethics, and this is why liberalism, I think, and the reason why we all do love liberalism, at least maybe not neoliberalism, but at least liberalism, is because there is a kind of allowance to the rules and the rules that we sign up for, or at least we find ourselves in, where you let that person be, you know, despite their interpretation of what their life means, you let them be. And that's why neoliberalism is the biggest deception, because neoliberalism says, oh, these corporations, we should allow them to be, but because of domination and geopolitics and the real of politics, they basically use that as an excuse where they can exploit the globalized worker, precariat, proletariat, who is not allowed to be because they have to work 10 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, to let them be, you know. And this is why letting be is an interesting ethical principle, because actually, if you introduce it, in my opinion, into any local conversation, which means science, which means politics, social sciences, political sciences, the real science, you know, I think letting be is a really interesting concept where you can actually, it actually is, from my opinion, something universal. Because, and I think actually what's hidden within this concept of letting be is beauty, is freedom, is allowance, is ethics. And I think it is determinable and determinate for philosophy. We can rationally think about it. And it's also phenomenological, as in when we let, for example, the end part of my PhD, it talks about the fact that actually we can let this question of truth go. We can let philosophy go. You can try and let philosophy go, like push it away. And then you wait and you go, well, I'm still alive and I'm still quite curious about my being. So what letting does is it also lets the question of letting go, and then you just encounter that experience, which I think is, in philosophical terms, you can use letting, lassen. But I think more contemporary terms, and that's been my challenge the last year. How to use the word letting be in contemporary terms. And like in conversation, it's about letting be is quite good, but like allowing, allowing that person to be. But if they're running at you with a knife, you don't let them be because they're not going to let you be. So actually there's a weird ethical domain to that kind of conceptualization. That's why I think it's a phenomenological experience of I'm going to let myself be or thrive by coming onto the net rather than getting home from work at 8 and wanting to sleep. I'm like, fuck it. Like, I want to let myself thrive. So I'm going to sit here and listen and participate in all of you letting this conversation happen. So I think just based upon this conversation, I know like it's kind of gone on tangent with the language that I use and the language I've been using for a few years. But I think there is something interesting to it. So actually, I had a proposal. One of the postdoc proposals I applied for, I didn't get the position. But still, I think the project's interesting because it's very ontological. It's called Letting Be as Truth, Experience, Freedom, and Normativity. I'll skip the bit. It's a project in the history of philosophy and systematic phenomenology that develops an account of truth grounded in the structure of experience. And that's the point here, I think, in the structure of lived experience, history, politics, individuality, language, psychology, psychotherapy, extends the concept of letting be into a framework for ethical thought, taking its departure from the later work of Martin Heidegger. The project asks how truth, understood as the event of letting be, could be clarified as a principle for living and thriving within a shared world. But there was something specific I wanted to read, which related more to the conversation. But I'm going to save it. I might put my hand up in a minute and bring it back in. Okay.
Absolutely magnificent. There was quite a lot that if I think about my own life, so generally for me, I tend to, as you know, I'll talk about self-forgetfulness with Keller. There is something about the ethical is that of which contributes to self-forgetfulness, because that is the state of the subject by which the stride of beauty is most likely to occur, and you are to avoid capture and things like that. So for an example, like I often think about, and I think it definitely letting be can be an ethical. And I think it's basically the only, to say something very large, it's the only way by which one can think the ethical and then not crowd out the beautiful. Like, because a lot that we'll talk about is how the beauty, Mr. Jockin will say, and I completely agree that we often collapse the beautiful into the good and actually just call something good. But the problem is you inevitably get violence because ideas of the good conflict, right? And this is you could argue this is the $1 million problem of pluralism, is that goods conflict, right? So then you can say, oh, we're supposed to get rid of the ethical. Well, it always comes down to, concentric circles, where if you get the beautiful, you get the good and the true as well. But if you get the good, you may not get the beautiful. And if you get the true, you may not get the good, right? And so you got to get, you want to get all of them. So the question becomes, okay, well, what is the ethics of the beautiful in a certain sense? Ergo, an ethics that does not collapse the beautiful into itself. There is absolutely something about letting be, hip hop cipher, all of those different things we discussed. That is part of that. So like for me, I often do kind of think about activities in terms of, is this contributing to my ability for things to strike me with a force of necessity that I did not plan? So for example, net conversations, afterwards you have ideas you never had before that strike you with a certain necessity and they come out of nowhere. You find the more you do this kind of thing, you find yourself able to think thoughts you don't intend that just appear. I think it is a huge deal for you to live your life in such a manner that the majority of your thoughts are appearing. They appear, that they're not really so much willed. And I think Mr. Jockin has also pointed out that there's something about memory that is some outside of your control, actually. What's very interesting is, for me, I associate your ethical life is reflected by the things that just kind of appear. Like, your ethic, like what appears says your ethical standing. And if what appears is an angry voice talking about how everyone sucks versus you, that would be a suggestion of a lack of ethics, right? So there's and also if memory and virtue are tied together, then there is something about virtue, meaning that you become the kind of person of whom things just appear. They just happen. And here's the funny thing. This is why letting is not necessarily, I think people hear letting and they think passivity, right? But when you learn, like, I guess, why is it that, I did it myself, I do it myself. Why is it that so many thinkers take walks? right? There's something about taking a walk that you're walking along and then bam, the idea for under the wing. And here's the funny thing. Once the idea hits you, you feel like you can be active about it and it's not an extension of the ego. This is the key. You move into activity that doesn't feel like it's just your power. That's also why it's like negentropic and it's not like meeting a deadline, right? And so what you're doing is you're trying to carry yourself in the world to where these things can hit you, right? Now, I think it starts leading to an ethic for me when you realize your number one enemy from that, therefore, is some sort of self-awareness, some sort of self-consciousness, usually as a result of insecurity. So let's mention, the talk I had with Seth and Aspasia. Like, I associate, like, being a man, like, quote unquote, what does it mean to be a man? Meaning I want to achieve masculinity so that I don't think about being a man. And what I mean by that is I want to learn how to use a saw so that if my brother has a tree fall and he needs help cutting it down, I just go over and cut it down and don't even think about it. But if I don't know how to use the saw, then I think about how I suck as a man and actually become self-conscious. So there's this way in which you want to develop skills and capacities that are manly, precisely so you don't think about being a man, precisely so that you maintain a posture of letting. So it goes with skills. So it goes with being able to encounter otherness. Most people encounter other and reflect on themselves, their inadequacy or their worldview or how that person is evil, and you're not letting anymore. You're now in the realm of basically deciding, labeling, and keeping out, right? So there's no letting. So then the question becomes, the ethical then would be that of which contributes to your ability to be surprised by otherness and not shut the letting down, right? And so what are the activities that do that? What are the activities that don't, right? And there's something about global pluralism that would necessitate this kind of ethic, where everyone is basically in the business of trying to live in such a manner that they can have the experience of which moves into activity be compelled by a feeling of necessity that is beyond them and thus not arbitrary. And that is contingent upon the kind of environments you live in. That is that is incubated into you by your living environments. If you're not surrounded, like if you're not reading books, then don't be surprised if stuff doesn't come out of nowhere for you. If you're not going through living environments, don't be surprised if you don't have, like, if you're not trying to surround yourself by the fullness of being, don't be surprised if you don't find yourself having ideas that you just come out of nowhere, right? Like, if in order to like, there's a way in which if in order to think you have to really try, like you really have to try, there's a lack of ethics. Like, if you really in order to make relationships work, really have to try, there's areas in your life that need development. But that gets into things like wit, being part of friendship that Mr. Jockin says. And then the giant claim would be that this ethical way of life is actually going to be increasingly selected for by the giant global interconnected world that is an unleashment of people's subconscious and desires, and basically everyone who's not able to do that is going to be crushed by the release of libidinal energy and the inability to forgive one another. And that's why Hikimorism is spreading. Because basically, if you're not able, like, it's all going to come down to some kind of letting. Like, let me put it this way, and all this has to be expanded on. I'm going to give it to Luber and then Mr. Winn. Letting is going to win. At the end of the day, everyone's life, you cannot survive. The human being always settles upon a life of letting eventually. The question is, can you do it with others and therefore it's negentropic, or can you only do it alone and therefore it's a closed system and entropic, right? And basically the interconnected world is the one where basically the ethic of letting is all that's left. And so you're either going to be a hikikomori or you're going to be more like the dancers in Dante. And that's the moment. That's the moment. And there's a lot more to say, but let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
It's like every time I'm on the net, how do I keep getting the same thought? This is the best net yet. Oh my God. It's insane that, and I want to talk on the conversation, but I just want to say what I'm experiencing right now is a really interesting kind of forgetfulness. And it happens all the time on the net where I have a bunch of things that I am thinking about coming into the net and I literally forget about it. It's like, forget about it. And like every time for some reason, I still go in with some like, okay, I want to talk about this. Let's have a conversation about this. I've been really thinking about this. And it's like, sometimes that happens, but definitely more times than not, it's like, oh my God, a totally different way of looking at the same thing, essentially. And it just fundamentally changes how I was even approaching the question that I had going into it. Ergo, I kind of forget about the question, like that initial question, which is really interesting. But so I wanted to I guess I want to just comment on letting be, because so like I'm rereading now and then because Javier's reading Hegel, I feel like I have to rip off the Band-Aid. So I feel like I'm going to commit to just like reading Phenomenology of Spirit, however long that takes me, and like nothing else after this reread. But I'm reading Heidegger's book on Kant, and all over the place he's using the word theme, and the way he's using it, to me, he's using it, how I resonate with it is when you're in a particular mode of, I am building something, I'm actively building something, it's going to be thematic. It's going to be thematic. And when you're doing it with collaborators, there's always this oscillation I have of letting them be with their execution or their idea, or do I intervene if I have something that rubs me? So then, what you're saying is like, well, with the knife example, if their letting be impedes my letting be, then I have to stop them, basically. So if I just like analogously map that onto the building with collaborators, it's like, okay, if their execution or idea is letting my being not be whatever, and like more specifically, let's just say it's like, oh, the tone is too cheeky, it's too schmaltzy, okay, and it's like rubbing you. When you how do you draw the line of basically, okay, in this particular instance, I can explain why it's rubbing me. Like, it's rubbing me because thematically it's giving off this connotation or this denotation or an inference, et cetera, and so forth. And like you're able to articulate it. With the knife example, it's very self-evident, like that real life example. But in most everyday life, you're actively building something with other people. And like you're in that mindset egoically, like I have an agenda, I have a pattern that I want to execute of some sort, and I'm saying it as broad as possible, because I do think it's all encompassing, where everyone is in this state of like, in a certain sense, I know what's best. So I'm thinking about it and using theme, and I think like we could go into his book on Kant, but just to get the general point out for sake of time, it's the reference for letting be is its thematic ties. So like how whatever the letting is, whatever the occurrence is, like how it's able to be articulated thematically, and whether you're able to point out deficiencies in that. So now, with that being said, I want to kind of talk about what Jockin was talking about the chiral image, because when he told me about that and I looked that up, I was like, holy shit. I was like, immediately I'm like thinking to myself like, okay, well, that's beginning, end of the story. It's a chiral image, first of all. Like it's like I looked at it was like very similar to like I wasn't finished being in time, but I was close to it, and like the world just like shook me, and I was just like looking, when you're reading, and it's like, everything kind of looks differently. It's like the chiral image is definitely one of those things for me. So like it's totally a mystery to me. Like why that's the case, like not necessarily why that's the case, because you can explain like for understanding purposes why there has to be a chiral image, but like the why from a finite position it's so like intricately already present is kind of, for me that's when you get into like, okay, there's like God or something, like it gives you that feeling a little bit. So anyway, I went on a tangent. The hierarchy, there was a point I wanted to push back on earlier, which is how we treat hierarchy, because I think like the women and men example, obviously from a human rights perspective, like we should be equal. But how I translate that is everybody deserves to have their own story. Everybody deserves to be in the story. Everyone deserves to, like, there's a difference between the stand-in guy who's the tree and the tree in Lord of the Rings that actually freaking talks. You know? Like there's a totally different meaning to that. And the transition basically was from tree to talking tree, essentially. From background to actual character to main character. And I would argue, like, from a general historical standpoint, women were probably always the main character the whole time. It was just you know, later revealed that to be the case, I think. And that's why I think you associate the femininity with spread. But I do think where it gets interesting is hierarchy still exists, but now it's in a totally different way. Like I think it even goes more particular. Phenomenologically, a 7 foot tall basketball player experiences life differently than me. They move differently. Like if I wanted to dunk a basketball, he's going to do it, and I'm not going to be able to do it. Like maybe I will after training, but to a significant degree that he can, it's impossible. It literally is impossible. I could be at the best health, best shape, and he could be in the best shape. So like this notion of like playing sports or like activities, I think are extremely phenomenologically particular. Like I don't think you can even do the split between the man and the woman. I think the question is, in terms of a story, who's servicing what? That to me is the hierarchy, and it's a hierarchy of not one that's better than the other, in the sense of in a vacuum, if you compare the two of them, one's better than the other. It's one's better for the service of the story, in which I'm also a part of. And like how to do that in real life, I don't know. This is totally just like theory to me, but I'm just trying to really take seriously the analogy of story and what goes into a story, with the metaphysics of what you're saying, letting be, and how that's essentially everything, and how to actually do that, like how to like the ethical question essentially. And I think virtue like is really interesting for that. But yeah, so I think we have to have a heuristic in which we are able to talk about the hierarchy of the operation of the story, and how to actually mediate when we're building, creating, et cetera, and so forth. How to mediate tension, which is essentially the manifestation of one's letting be, not letting another. Right? Something like that. I would say all tension kind of boils down to that to some capacity. And like how to actually like talk about that and alleviate that in an appropriate way. So like appropriate events, right? I think to me, Heidegger kind of how he places theme and how he uses it and how he even defines it at times is like the answer. And like I'm all ears on like the scholarship of it and whatnot. Like I could totally be wrong even. I'm open to that. But I just think there's something to thinking about how a theme works. What is a theme that helps us talk and mediate a lot of this stuff? That I was just I don't have answers to, but I'm only saying it hoping someone else does, honestly. So I'll just I'll pass it off.
No, magnificent. There is something about like to say something very large for me, that would need a lot of justification, but there is something about the theme of being has something to do that there is no possible circumstance in which being will not catch you. Now that's a meta-geometrical claim, but basically a reason why you're free to let be is because whatever manifests will be that of which actually, if you continue to let be and you don't step in with your ego or your own determinations, that there's a way that reality unfolds to actually catch you with the strike of beauty, and to actually unlock and unfold things that otherwise could not occur. Like there's something by how reality unfolds that actually has this holding principle to it. And no matter what occurs, that happens, but it always manifests in different ways. And every single time you run the risk of forgetting because you were caught last time, but this time maybe not, and then maybe not, and this maybe not. And you have to hold the memory that it will catch you, because you can always forget it because there's always good reason to think this time will be different. This time will be different. And that I think ultimately is why there's something so deep about courage, because it's like linked directly with the metageometry of how things unfold. I think also too on that kind of idea that coming with an initial question like to the net and a kind of letting go, I think that's precisely kind of the orientation that is necessary for global pluralism. People come in with maps, they come in with ideas, they know what they're going to say, they know their beliefs, and it all goes away. And yet in letting it all go away, they actually are able to have their belief, their map appear to them in a new way that's more aligned with the girdle point. The girdle point actually makes the map have higher dimensionality. But that ability to actually, you notice you're coming in with something, but you're willing to let it go, so then it can come back to you actually in a new way. That's like what Winn was saying, like you're able to let it go. Let me just let go of philosophy, and then it comes back. That very coming back is, I guess, what I have in mind by this way that reality holds. Like, and you can't experience being with this holding characteristic unless you let things go. Because then you can never know. There's always the question of, is it still with you because you held on to it, or is there actually something about being that is giving you as a gift? And Mr. Winn emphasizes in his paper, gift, and all of his thinking. And I do think there's something to be said about it is extremely important for you to experience everything in your life as a kind of gift. The religions were very good on this. They stressed it. But that's also, you could say the religion stressed sacrifice. Like you lose whatever you don't give up. And there was this idea that everything in your life has to be put on the altar or else you won't have it. Because if you keep it, it will die. But if you let it go, then it can come back to you with a quality it otherwise couldn't have occurred unless you let it go. And I think basically religions had practices. They didn't obviously use the language of letting and letting be and letting as an ethic. But isn't it interesting that there was a kind of ethic around sacrifice, an ethic around giving things up to God? And we can all see that. You see, the problem is we often associate sacrifices to God with, God as a kind of egotist or whatever, but actually it is the possibility of the experience of the letting where things can come back to you in this certain quality. And I think without that, we die. And I guess the last thing I'm now thinking about on the knife example, there's a million other things to be said, is for me, there's something very interesting where, and then I'll give it to Mr. Winn, and if anyone has final things to say on this fine evening, I think in the phenomenology, which of course I'm a massive fan of, as Mr. Winn also is pointing to. So if someone's attacking you with a knife, and I think like this will also apply to the more subtle examples, then the experience to defend yourself, I would argue you don't feel egoically. It appears in you. Almost like on a it's not an ego, it's like the letting be included the activity of defending yourself phenomenologically, right? So likewise, when I look up and like if a branch was falling and I got out of the way, it is as if the world, to say it this way, it is if the world gave me the activity and it's an extension of my letting. Like if you move into an activity in the state of letting, it will look as if you left the letting behind, but actually it's an extension of it as a manifestation, because there's also something to be said. If you're unwilling to act, then you're not letting. If you say, well, I better not act because I got to let be, well, there's a problem in that, because you're actually then saying that letting be can't include activity. You ought to let the letting be include activity, right? And there is also, of course, something to be said about activity. They're going to take away your letting be, right? So that's, of course, an ethical basis as well. But there's something about, like, in the role, like the world is constantly giving you experiences to respond to, that you can just, in your letting be, have those encounters. Like there's the experience of the forest. So you're not thinking, I'm going to look at the forest right now. It's just I'm looking at the forest. And because you actually let the determinations give you in your letting that call, that choice is an extension of the letting. And the same way that, like, I like to say with a lot of these theological conversations about God's freedom or whatever, if God chooses to create the world and binds himself to logic, because there was that idea that Jockin was bringing about the Greek gods, they can't change history. Well, if I make the example, like, God creates the world and actually is bound to not make 2 + 2 = 5. Well, people would say, well, God can do anything. But if God chose that restriction, it's actually an extension of his freedom, right? Like, he could make 2 + 2 = 5, but he doesn't, because it would tear down the cosmos, right? So that restriction is actually an expression of his choice. Well, in my opinion, activity from letting is actually an extension of the letting. And you experience it very differently. Like, you don't experience, like, when you're responding to someone attacking you, the very phenomenology of that experience is very different from if you attack someone with a knife or you want to attack them, right? And I think basically, obviously, because I did so much with wushu and various forms of martial arts, is that, not that I had any massive expertise or anything, but the experience, there is absolutely something about letting, that what you learn in Eastern martial arts, and it's a caricature, but there's truth to it. You always are learning in various forms of martial arts, or some of them at least, actually how the letting is how, like, you fight better in letting. Like, there's actually something about, because you're more energetic, you're more negentropic, you don't waste energy so quickly. You're able to actually respond better. That just applies to everything. That logic applies to everything. And thus, the ethical is that of which gives you that mode. And really, the number one thing that takes it from us is the encounter with the other person. It's way easier to be in a state of letting, and I talk about self-forgetfulness and all of that, which I'm obviously overlapping here, but it is way easier to be letting to the tree than to the neighbor that annoys you. Way easier. Global pluralism hinges upon the ability to maintain a state of letting with the neighbor who annoys you. If we can't do that, then you can't have that strike of necessity that is not reducible to a singular particularity to make space for diversity, and you're not going to get the theme. You're definitely not going to, because here's the thing. When you let the neighbor, but like, when you get pissed off at the neighbor ignoring you, you don't believe that being will catch you. You don't believe there's something on the other side that being will hold you in. You think you have to take the interaction into your own power, or if there's somebody threatening you, you don't believe that actually if you let them be in their difference that makes you feel threatened, that actually there's something that being can now make you experience that otherwise you wouldn't. We don't believe that being is alive. We don't. I mean, we don't. I would argue many people who believe in God don't actually believe God is alive. They don't believe that God is an active component of reality. They think it's an abstraction. But no, there's something about letting that is actually to believe that there is an element to how the world unfolds that is for you, that is for the beautiful, that is for the experience of great. And the ethical has to be tied to that. Otherwise, it's just going to be people's opinions, pragmatism, ageism. It's going to be systems. It's always going to be systems. How to increase some sort of systemization of efficiency for the good, et cetera, so forth. But let me stop and give it to Mr. Winn. Mr. Winn, please.
As what Andrew said about, like, coming into the net with an idea and then it dissipates. It's like even the in between of having an idea, raising the hand, then having my chance to, like, speak. I'll let myself be. The main thing is, like, I wanted to respond to what Luber said about if you're in, like, for example, in a conversation with 10 people who are writers and you're kind of collaborating on an idea or ideas of a book, and so you're talking about theme. I think, like, the whole point of conversation is that conversation is a kind of letting be itself. And I think annoying people generally are those that within conversation approach conversation as thesis, you know, like this is not just my story, but how the story should be. And I think there is truth. Like, for my opinion, I prefer certain stories over than others. And then there's the question of like, is there a good story? Is there a bad story? Like beyond a story which comes from a particular culture, like is there universally a good story, you know, or an interesting story? It reminds me, Heidegger talks about like poetry, language, thought. He talks about theme a lot, and he talks about like what makes a good artist, what makes a good poet. And for him, it's one which, like Daniel said, is you can allow life or thinking or the waterfall and the sound of the waterfall, but then the bridge which passes by, which goes to a town in Germany in the 18th century, which had a particular food, which was then used because it then was devoted to the gods in the Greek times, and you read a book on it, and then that brings in the book from the bookshop. And like for Heidegger, a thing is something, and probably with the Kant book, he talks about this, like the question concerning a thing is the book that I've read on Kant, where there's like, what is a thing? A thing is something which gathers to mind a world, like historical world, but also things like the religion in that historical world or the lack of religion, which would use a cup or a chalice to praise the gods, you know? And then the chalice then introduces the blood or the liquid or the wine. And all of this is opening up the story of themes. So like a good artist, and this is the origin of the work of art, is someone who can open up a world, you know, who allows the world to shine forth. And this is why he does prefer the Greeks, because he thinks that the Greek way of experiencing things was way more likely to let the thing itself shine. Then, of course, modern metaphysics says, well, the thing itself was never shining. It was your determination that you posited onto it. You know, and that's like for Heidegger, the problem with modern metaphysics, it came up with this idea of framing, of positing, of placing. And so like Hegel's critique is that the Greeks talk about this thing outside of language, that language kind of is experiencing of itself. Hegel was like, no, we are positing, you know? And that's another topic, but then it's like, either way for Heidegger, you have to let the positing be a thing. You have to let the fact that in this period, in this historical epoch, we might experience things as objects that can be used for some end, you know? Like he even lets that be. And I think this is what I found with Heidegger to be the most interesting thing, was just like, allow everything to be, allow forgetfulness to be. Don't stress out if you don't read philosophy in a year. Let yourself be, and maybe in that waiting and saying, okay, actually, like, it's contingent, I've had to work more, you're then more excited because you're not feeling guilty about not reading. You're actually then probably motivated intrinsically to like make more time, pick up that book, you know, get on the net. So I think basically to go back to the point I wanted to make is like in conversation, and I think my friend's like my good friend now is just starting his PhD in psychotherapy, and he loves Heidegger now. I've converted. But he's actually like coming up with this idea of doing his PhD on letting be in existential psychotherapy, because we spoke about this a lot, and he thinks existentialism, like we said at the beginning of the conversation, is there are historical worlds, there is no ontological primal determinacy of something which is beyond history. There is just, you know, there's no spread. And if it's spread, it's just going to be one kind of framing dominating another, you know, one culture dominating another. But he's like, well, maybe, and that's a problem for psychotherapy, because what do? Do you just accept the relativity of ideas? Is that what psychotherapists are bringing you to, like to accept the freedom of that? And I think that's existentialism, accept the freedom of the contingency of ideas. And there is a joy to that, you know, but I think there's something more, which is letting. So now he's trying to see if letting be can be a principle for psychotherapy, actually, as like something you can share with the patient, with the person who's paying you money to talk about themselves and their history and their traumas and their ideas and their projections. Can letting be a grounding force for therapy? And I think it can, precisely because it enables one to orientate themselves in a way where it's like, yes, historical freedom. Yes, we live in a society which is determined by prior decisions, you know, out of the necessity of those decisions. It's not avoiding that, but I think letting be is a way to deal with it, which is more. I don't know. Yeah, more. And I had a few other points, but I kind of wanted. Yeah, there was something else I wanted to say, but I didn't write it down, and now it's not there. Maybe I should trust myself more. Oh, one more example, and then I will have to go to bed because I've got work tomorrow. I also wrote this little idea on infectious diseases, ethics. There was a job, but it was interesting because I tried to apply it to this. So I said letting be can be a foundational. I'll just quickly summarize it. Can be a foundational ethical imperative for infectious disease ethics and pandemics governance. Sounds really boring, but I think it's a good example of actually how letting be is that kind of principle. So letting be does not mean non-interference. It names the active sustaining of the conditions under which beings, human and non-human, can come into presence and continue to be in an authentic way. Beings do not exist in isolation, but within a shared, difference-preserving field in which they mutually enable and constrain one another. Ethical life begins from responsiveness to this field. And I said, from this starting point, the project advances the simple claim that what is good is not the unrestricted flourishing of all forms of life, because that would be resignation and passivity to like life's moving of itself and I'm going to sit here and watch it. Instead, what is good is the cultivation of those forms of life that sustain the conditions of shared existence and the constraint of those that undermine them. Infectious diseases bring this into sharp focus. Pathogens belong to the same relational field as all other beings, yet where their proliferation erodes the conditions on which beings can continue to be, their limitation, so through vaccination, public health measures, coordinated intervention, is not opposed to the ethical imperative of letting be, but required by it. So like, and it was interesting. I was playing with this idea. I didn't believe it when I was writing. In a way, I was like, oh, this is way too like absolute determination. Like letting be is an absolute letting principle. But then again, all it's saying is, I'm not telling you like that a specific system is good. I'm telling you that if there is something, and this is what Jockin, you said, like a tree and wood, and particular wood will give off a particular smell. You know, like there is a relation in life or of life where things naturally kind of come from that, you know, they appear from that thing. And it's not avoiding that, but then it's saying like if pathogens are quote unquote existing, then letting would allow things to take place or not take place. And actually, I think that's why it could be a universal rule. You know, it's not saying like pathogens in themselves are evil. They're not. Like they're neutral, in my opinion. You know, it's just the way in which they shorten my life, and I feel like I want to let my life be because I'm enjoying this life. Then I don't want pathogens in my body. You know. So yeah. Anyway, so that was just a sorry. Yeah. And the same as so go back to Luber. I think conversation itself should also be sustained through letting be. I think it's the only way to allow the spread to spread within the contingent series of differencing ideas. That's why I put differencing preserving. Like we want to preserve difference. We want to preserve the ability to be spontaneous and come up or wait for those new ideas or come up with new ideas, you know? Like scientists. I thought it's always the thing with like actual scientific discoveries. Like what is happening in that moment? Is it waiting and allowing on the walk, you know, like the apple on the head? And then maybe it's both. Maybe it is also positing and like strictly overly determining what something is and like failing to do it and then realizing, you know. And I think that's you allow both. I think you allow forgetfulness, you allow technology, you allow AI, I think. But then again, like, so this was another one was like, how do you align AI to ethical principles? And it's like, well, if you teach AI like letting be, it will hopefully let us be. As long as like we're letting be as well, I think, you know, because then it would say, well, humans aren't letting be, and if in order to let the world be, humans are destroying the world, I must not let humans be. So we better start letting.
We
There
better
you go.
start letting. No, I completely agree, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber here. No, magnificent. So, there is something about letting be that gets tied into a mode of participation that in a certain sense makes existence relevant, that makes the world relevant, that makes the environment relevant. Like there's a way, like you said something about a shared existence, because it would seem as if pluralism requires a shared existence. There seems to be an issue where we have an existence we share, but we don't believe existence is shared. Like that, there's actually something about sharing that is the essence of existence. We treat existence like a landscape or territory. We share it in that we both stand upon it, right? But the territory is there if we're not there, right? But there's something actually about a shared existence that is existence. And therefore, if we don't figure out how to share it, then there's a sense in which there's not existence. Like there's a lack of there's a lack of being, but that lack actually calls us to the sharing. And there's something about letting be that is actually the experience of existence as afforded by sharing. But you have to then figure out how to share. And I think when two people are letting be, there's something about activity is already occurring, right? Like there's world that's already worlding. So the letting be, it's not, the mind can hear letting be and kind of go, oh, well, you have like what's going to get stuff moving, what's going to get stuff going, right? The life is living. Like it is there, actually. And the problem is that we don't let it be, and therefore we respond out of whack. Like letting be is a response question, right? The ethical, yeah, great, exactly. So there's a problem where we tend toward the scaling that is extremely problematic because we are not letting be. We are actively responding, and thus we have a frame, thus we have an idea of what is right that we impose, as opposed to actually letting be, to which then we are afforded the activity that's an extension of the letting be that has a far better chance by being that thus it's more like nature and spreading and ecosystemically balanced and can afford complexity instead of killing everything, right? And there's a way in which the ethical is what actually affords shared existence, sharing existence as that of which is only afforded by a certain sharing. And of course, nature shows that all the time. The forest is fundamental. You can't talk about a forest unless you're talking about sharing, because the ground, everything is sharing. We talk about relationships, it's tied to sharing. But sharing is a language of ethics. Like there's an ought in the sharing, right? And of course, then the idea is that theme and existence are tied, because theme is the sharing existence. It is the existence that then puts an organizing principle. There's a zillion more things. There's also something. So basically, what is being suggested is that letting be cannot be scaled. It can only be spread. So letting be has to be spread. If it's scaled, then there's an activity, there is an imposition, there is something that is going to be imposed, a frame, right? So basically, letting be is what has to be spread. And the question then becomes, what does letting be afford that is spread that would then change the way that people behave, that would then actually be, in a certain sense, selected for? Or because when we talk about environment, like the way I've been saying environment, the word environment could go meta, environment, and story. Like, what's the story going to select for? Like, what's it going to select for? And I think it's going to select for people. Y'all were saying at the Friends of the Beautiful, it's exactly right. Virtue stays in the thing, dang it. Virtue doesn't withdraw. The story is going to select for people who don't leave the story. Like that's the story. Do you stay in the story or not? Like, that's the big question. So the story is about people that want to stay in the story or leave story behind. Hikimorism, right? But guess what it means to stay in story? And I'll give it to, let me stop. To stay in story means you can deal with people who piss you off. Like, that's what a story requires, people who piss you off. Otherwise, there's no activity. That means you have to be able to handle the collective subconscious and desires and all the things that are thrown at you. And if you can't let be, the collective subconscious is going to select you out, and you're not going to make babies because you're going to be a hikikomori and can't handle others. Or let me stop and give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Winn. Mr. Luber, please.
I completely agree on your point, and there's a lot to be said. I think so. Like, I have this Kantian urge that basically, like the categorical imperative, how there is this, no matter what rules, regulations, modes to think through, to follow. I think Kant placed it in the wrong place. I think he placed it on morality, which is a very shallow aspect of what's on the surface of a story. That's why I think, like, to me, how I would like to do it is there is this subjective freedom in bouncing through different ideas and expressing them. It's the filtration of that. So not the filtration, that's the wrong word. For example, in education, right? We have to educate people to be able to speak language. There's grammar. There's certain aspects of language, for example, or language itself that are necessary to even have a conversation. Now, if I talk gibberish and those are my expressions, or let's say, here's my idea, yellow flag down. Like, what? You know, like, you can't, like, you wouldn't be able to work with that, right? So then there's getting it to the level of, oh, what if someone runs naked with a yellow flag? Okay, now I understand that. But then the question is, why that, right? So, like, when I'm thinking about having a conversation where you're open to being able to talk and express your ideas, but you're already thinking about them thematically, therefore the relevancy, which was Daniel's point, the relevancy of them is undeniable in the sense of I have to respond or address to it. So it's isomorphic in the sense of, okay, I can even talk about the theme because there's something like AI, there's something like COVID, there's something like these things that have happened that forced me to question what a human being is and does, which puts the entire story of what a human being into question. So, like, if you take that all the way down to the actual every day I'm building something with someone, you want to be able to propose ideas or say something that force a response. It forces you. So it's like a big question that screenwriters will have is the why now? Why does this story have to be told now, right? And I think if you take that type of question, or the question that I like to ask is why this story versus another story, which is getting to the same point. If you take that question all the way down to every single detail that you can see in the story, it gets really, really complex. Basically, when you ask that question, it forces you to have an answer. Now, virtue, or the concept of staying with the story, right? Staying with the story means that you have to stick with all these questions and stay with it throughout the entire process for the sake of understanding the theme. Like, you posit the theme in the beginning of the journey, but you don't, and this is where it's very Kantian for me, because you have to posit the theme at first, which I think he's totally right about. But where I think he's wrong is not placing it at a metaphysical level and saying that you can't place it on a metaphysical level. In fact, you can only place something like that morally, where morally you can know how to behave, precisely because you can't place something law-like metaphysically. Like, because you can't know the thing in itself, you're able to then have a law-like heuristic for moral behavior, where I think the fact that you can't know the thing in itself means you actually have to stay with that. And in that sense, moral behavior becomes super contextually dependent, and you actually can't make it a law in that sense. Now, it's a law, more like morality's relation to law, in my opinion, is relating the context in which the moral question is inquiring about to the staying with the unknown metaphysical nature of things. And that relation right there can be understood as law. and like and like so in that sense, there's a way of talking about it. And like I hope Winn watches it. I want to talk to Winn about this. I might even like offline message him. But it's the concept of like bounce and distance and like these heuristics of how to work with still trying to understand the positive theme. Because it's like how many times you rewrite thinking about bounce and distance, but they're guiding tools to help you move through that perspective that you have on the theme, then to watch it again as a whole and to have notes that make you have questions about how to understand the theme here, which make you then reevaluate the focus again and make you make these little shifts in focus. And then it's like, and this is where I think, like, I do believe everybody is existentialist, but I don't think everybody is like a philosopher proper in the sense of, in this respect, the question on focus, I think you can only be a philosopher, because there's a lot of overlaps between honesty, maturity, belonging, friendship, but they're all different and they all have their own different domain. And in a story, when you're focusing, oh, well, the reason why this part is actually a little corny is because the focus is too much on friendship, which actually is bad distance because they're going to become friends. And I actually think the focus should be more about honesty, because honesty is not the same as friendship. And just because you're honest doesn't mean you're going to be friends. Like, that's why focus matters. And being able to think through those distinctions like that is what makes you a philosopher in today's day and age. I do believe everybody can think about what is life, what is purpose, more of the broad questions, and have a certain position on it. But when you get to the nitty gritty details of, as we're progressing through your thought path, your movement of thought, there's contradictions that come up because there's distinctions that need to be made. Make those distinctions so I can now flow through your thought path. So I do think there is actually a way of educating and talking in a certain geometric mode, when you're thinking in a certain geometric way. And it's about what is the stakes and how do we feel about them. That is where it needs to get content, in my opinion. Morality does not do that. Morality is a deviation downstream from that. Because morality is only in relation to how you feel about the stakes, which means you have to have an understanding of the stakes. And obviously there's an affect that comes with that. So like, I think that's really where we need to think more content, actually. But like, I'm curious what you guys think, especially Jockin, who's great at poo-pooing on Kant. But yeah, I'll pass it off.
Well, first, fantastic background. All purchases are greatly appreciated. God bless you. So I will accept that. Second, so there's a different. So for me, the way that his law is being described is a condition for the experience of the unveiling of the surprise. And it is a surprise that is not chaos, but one that brings with it a certain contingent necessity that makes you go this, and that this is actually what you are oriented toward. The reason why I'm okay with that is because it can't be captured and systemized and used by the system in order to control people. And the problem is that if you say the categorical imperative is, basically treat others as you want to be treated, kind of basically, well, then the state can decide what that means and control people, right? But Kant's I would just say there is something about the relationship that is afforded necessarily there. I'll throw it to you, Luber. That actually, I think, is actually very important. But the key is, there has to be an emphasis on the treatment that can only be discovered in the relationship. You can't bring to the encounter with the other person the idea of how you want to be treated, that you then treat them. There has to be a mode of treatment that only can be known in the relationship, that thus has a certain authority beyond a reducible point, and therefore it has something more like a geometry. But that the issue is, in another way, Kantianism serving the state versus the social. You could also say there's also I had a bunch of other things, but Luber, please.
I just wanted to give a real example of exactly what I mean too. I think you're exactly like, I'm totally with what you're saying. But I'm really curious on like how to translate that, what I'm about to say. So like when in editing The Hunt, the focus for a lot of the exposition was on loneliness. Okay. Then one day, 2 weeks ago, Alex, he's the editor. Okay. So he's really getting to the nitty gritty, and I'm just kind of sitting behind him half the time, you know? He just says to Tyler and I, who's our other collaborator, I actually think the focus is freedom, not loneliness. Here's why. And I made this whole argument of why it was loneliness months ago and how we have to shift it from community. The focus was on community, and then it shifted to its complete negation, alienation, to now it's now sublated, literally in my head, to freedom. I'm not even kidding. That's how this happened. And he was able to explain why it's freedom. He would go through this scene, this scene, this scene. This is why this is like this, because it's thematically it's servicing the theme in this way. It's servicing this reveal, essentially, this surprise. But how I feel when we get to the surprise doesn't feel right, because it's affecting my level of care. It's affecting my level of care is basically what it came down to. And I can explain in a more thematic way like what that means, but for the sake of getting the sentiment across, he's able to explain why he doesn't care about it. And then by shifting the focus to freedom, we were able to make definitive changes in the scene that actually, when we got to the reveal, changed how we were even going to do the reveal, which then made us care to the way we wanted to care in a specific way, because theme gets to a specific way of caring. It's not just care in general, because you want to care about it in a certain way. So it's like he was right. He was able to prove literally how, and obviously like you got to show other people, and so maybe that might not translate, who knows. But like in this anecdotal example, he was able to talk using a certain definitions, basically, like rules, you know, like categorical imperatives, basically, but in a different, in terms of a story, in terms of what's at stake here, how do we show that which is at stake, that kind of way. So I agree with the conversation, but it was a conversation, and it was an open one, but yet it was spoken about in these like rigid geometric ways of thinking that causes an explosion of ideas. That's why it's free to talk about in such a free way, because you could do it in so many ways. But I'm sorry, I'll pass it back. I just wanted to clarify.
No, I think that's all. But one of the keys there, though, is that you're using a certain awareness of history by which to determine the conditions, not an abstract universality. Like, because also, like George Shaw said, is, okay, do unto others what you want done. Well, what if your neighbor doesn't like it? What if your neighbor doesn't like what you like done unto you, right? Like you have to then, and so it doesn't actually stand in all circumstances, because the question is, what is the content of that categorical imperative? The key that what you're describing is you're talking about law and conditionality that is afforded by the existence of content that creates sort of like something law because there is content there, right? And that content is inseparable from the emergence of the law, right? Of which only came together because there's a history to review. And so then I think that gets into like you have to have like history is absolute. There's a way in which history is absolute content. it is content that is absolute. Like, because when you wrote it in the past, you're putting together, like, there's always something about story that is historical, right? So what you're doing, and also too, notice that the experience of care and surprise go together, right? Like, there's a way in which Kant's categorical imperative is saying you should care, like you must care, right? But with a lack of content, the care, you can't force care. It's like talking about be friends, Thomas Winn, right? So what has to happen is the categorical imperative has to afford the experience of care, not command it, which can only be done by a surprise of conditions that then require, like you're saying, a certain kind of focus. I completely agree on everything you're saying. When Peter Berger says everyone's an existentialist now, the problem is they don't know it. Like, they are and they don't know it, so they don't get good at it, and they're overwhelmed by anxiety, and all these other problems happen, right? Like, there's not an awareness that philosophical consciousness is spread, so then people are overwhelmed because they don't know what to do, et cetera, so forth. So completely agree with that, and there's something about focus, but a lull. But notice also too, with that example, there's a certain letting be. You let Alex speak. You let yourself be presented with the construct. You let it be presented with the evidence that you don't care, and you let yourself also feel the care that occurred, right? When the story was constructed according to freedom in a different way, right? So you had to be an active element, not dispassionate, an active element in the experience of saying that's a law, because someone else could come along. Someone could theoretically come along and say no. Why? Because they're not paying attention. They're not focusing. They're not paying attention. They say, nah, Alex, you're wrong. I don't know. Well, why is that? Because they're not focusing. They're not paying attention, right? Well, that means there's a subjective element that has to be aware, right? That has to be paying attention, that allows themselves to come to care, allows themselves to be struck. Scale is all about, Scale's all about removing that risk. Scale don't want that risk. Scale's like, well, we gotta make a system that accounts for people who are paying attention versus not paying attention versus focus. Spread is only possible if you have people that are focused. Like, there's a certain focus and attentiveness, and what has to spread is that mode of attention that allows this strike of care, and that then creates a lull, if you will, that is a binding necessity, but it's not top down, but it's like a gift of care. Because you cared, you get to experience, because you were open, you get to experience a care that is simultaneous with the condition, and thus you follow it. Like, the problem is law is you don't want to follow it, so I have to guilt you to it, and let me put it this way. Much of the problem with law that is too abstract is you have to have an enforcement mechanism. Someone has to enforce it. And the problem, well, there you go, you're screwed now. But with what you're describing, is an experience of something law-like that doesn't have to be enforced. That is a big deal, because now you're in the realm of the social, not the state. Now you're in the realm of the human. So basically, pluralism only survives if we can spread something law-like that doesn't have to be enforced. And basically, the charge against Kant, in my opinion, would be to say that he doesn't take care of the enforcement problem, that the categorical imperative must be enforced in his construction. And the way you're describing it, you deal with the enforcement problem. That is a huge difference. And basically, global pluralism is doomed without something that has that kind of necessity, but doesn't require enforcement, which sounds like you'd need something like attraction, which sounds like you'd need something like beauty. There was a lot more on theme, but I'm going to stop and give it to Jockin. I suppose I will have to go in a bit, but not yet. Mr. Jockin.
I mean, that's excellent what you're saying, Daniel. I think it's absolutely true to enforcement, right? Because that's the point. You need some kind of artifice to impose the law, right? So, which should instantly get everyone suspicious. The other area I was going to comment on was where we do see the Kantian operation of morality and ethics, which is trajectories, protocols. When someone says, I'm ideating killing myself, no, you're not supposed to operate, you're not supposed to connect with this person individually. You need to operate on the trajectory of reporting this person, right? So, and I remember how you're talking about this in the military. I think that example very clearly, where there is no way to engage with this person individually. You have to just go through the trajectory now of the protocol, and that's how we deal with this. So, I find that very interesting, because that's almost a balancing act, because now there's a social mechanism with the trajectory to tell you how to interact with it. So because now what I'm hearing from you, Luber, is that takes away story. There is no story, because there's no counterfactuality. So what's the stakes here is always about this person could have done X or they could have done Y, and they chose Y. That's interesting, right? And that's based on a history and a pattern and that reversal of the pattern. That's what I'm imagining. You didn't give us particular content, but I'm imagining that's the more formal discussion of what's going on there. If you know introductory logics, that doesn't happen. It's just a force of necessity. It just has to be this way. And that's it. There is no now, and then the only one there is to do it or not do it. I think that's also very interesting. That should always be very suspicious, because now the question is, now you're liable, now you're morally responsible, now you're ethically responsible because you did not report your colleague into the military, into the chain of command for suicide capture, right? To be thrown into a room. I find that very interesting. That's very much not story, or maybe it could be. I don't know. It just feels very different from what's at stake here. I find it very interesting. So I think that's my only note at the moment on this question. What's being brought up here? But I think absolutely and actually I'll say this from teaching too. So I did a modality where, because I had a very wide range of students, I started using video recordings of my lectures for software training and concepts, so that students who really struggled with it, they can use pause, replay, fast forward, all that. And it worked. That all worked out great. But there was an unexpected, and that's like something I will comment generally. Any kind of intervention has an unexpected consequence. Sometimes for the positive and sometimes for the negative. What the negative was, I was waiting for it. But I didn't anticipate it. I thought, if I do this, the risk is students go, I don't need to be here. I can just watch the videos and that's it. It took about halfway through the semester. So probably at first they really didn't think that, or they feel like the calculus didn't motivate them to do it, because typically the energy of a classroom is pretty high at the beginning. Then about midterms it half lives, and then at 3/4 of the way half lives again. So then guess when it happened? Right at midterm. Right at midterm, boom. The structure was, the incentive was there. People acted on it. And then when class went from 12 to 5 instantly, as soon as it happened. It was so dramatic. It was amazing. And I was like, okay, interesting. And then basically my colleagues all said, well, clearly now you have to grade them. You got to use now some forcing mechanism to force them to show up. And I was like, yeah, it's there. The only one that I put in, the most elegant one I found that did work, was I just simply said, oh, your assignments that are due for all these projects. So what they were doing is they were not only missing the progress critiques, they were just not even coming to the final critiques for assignments. So they went all the way into oh, I could just do this all online and submit my work and call it a day. All I said was, oh, for your assignments for each module, you have to be in class to hand it in, or it won't be accepted. Instantly worked. Instantly, boom, everyone came. It's still external that's an enforcement mechanism. So it's not a perfectly naturalistic one. One would wish this is the issue. One would wish that the desire of them wanting to learn would motivate them to be there, right? Or the desire to get. And I do say this. I started at first. The natural consequences, if you don't show up and do the work, your grade's going to be mediocre. You're not going to do well. But that wasn't enough. People were like, "That's fine. I'll take my mediocre grade." But there were comments. But that's the thing. So, which one can argue that's perfectly fine if I should just let them be okay with it. But there are second. But the problem is that I know this, that there is learning experiences, and it didn't happen. Students who were failing because they weren't coming to class to see their other students do their work and see the discourse of us talking about it. That's why I knew where the natural consequence was too harmful for them. So I had to use this as soft of a forcing mechanism as possible, which is to simply put a rule inside the handing of the assignment. But what was fun about it was how radically quick it just instantly turned it right back. Everybody showed up. So I'm just talking out loud to say this is the tension, because now it's like you want to have a operation of law of ethics that doesn't have enforcement, but yet enforcement has to be there. And the one you want to use is natural enforcement of nature, but sometimes that's not acceptable for various reasons. So then what do? Or maybe discernment-wise, we have to say the most minimal, the lightest amount of intervention possible, where it's the least arbitrary. It's the most natural to the situation you're dealing with. But that's, just to talk through that problem. But that's in contrast to straight up trajectories, and there actually protocols for ethics where we don't think just follow the protocol. Takes away the stakes in terms of any kind of story for the persons involved. I'll stop with that.
No, magnificent. There is something about design, to speak generally, there is something about design that is attempting to achieve something law-like without enforcement. And I think basically that also occurs what you're doing with story. Like there's something, because stakes will allow law-like behavior without enforcement, because the stakes do it, right? And so the problem, and you could also argue that any philosophy that requires some kind of enforcement is not going to deal with global pluralism. So it goes with theology and everything, right? If you have to enforce it, there's a problem. And that doesn't mean there's no role of enforcement anywhere, just like I associate enforcement with bestowing, and Nietzsche's critique of bestowing. So to ask the question, can anyone leave Plato's cave on their own, which is an incubation and an environmental question, ultimately, in a certain regard. But if people have to perfectly understand your philosophy in order to live it, then there's a problem. Because if it has to be perfectly followed. And I think there's also something interesting as we're speaking of thinking about religions as often in the business of figuring out how to move from law-like behavior via enforcement gradually to law-like behavior without enforcement. Like you start with the laws, God says this, God does that, and there's a gradual movement toward the all of God, or you do it because you love God, or you have a relationship with God. Well, it's interesting to think of religions in the business of figuring out how to move through time, or law by enforcement to law-like behavior via more attraction or beauty, right? And religions that fail to do that end up in trouble, right? And so you could say and you could argue, and the argument would be that at a certain level of scale, it becomes impossible for the system to create law-like behavior without enforcement. And that's when scale is done. But spread has the possibility there is no necessary point, this would be my claim, there is no necessary point where spread to generate law-like behavior will require enforcement. It could, maybe it doesn't achieve it, but it could theoretically always have law-like behavior and thus not chaos, thus condition, thus structure, thus something meaningful, or something intelligible to afford belonging. Because if you don't have any structure at all, you can't have belonging. But if you have too much structure, you have problems. There is no necessary point at which spread would have to transition into law-like behavior by enforcement. Spread could have structure always that operates by meaningful pattern, repeated pattern, because law and pattern kind of go together, right? Like when you have law, you're trying to create pattern. So to say like law-like, because when you're talking about the law-like in story, there's a pattern. You're seeing a pattern, right? So, and law is trying to make sure we always have a consistent, the pattern repeats of people interacting and not murdering. The pattern repeats of people going into the store and not stealing, right? But the problem is law by enforcement is pattern secondarily. What we are describing is the necessity of some sort of ability to have attention to pattern more primarily, like more actively, more aware of, and of course, pattern and theme go together, right? And so then the question, so spread could have pattern, law-like, and law-like is very important versus law, obviously, law-like behavior without enforcement, which almost by definition has to be some kind of attraction, ergo shared holding. And I am of the opinion that being itself entails a metageometry of holding, that it actually, like the forms, like everything in being actually does hold. It has a holding principle by the way things unfold, that they give themselves, and that, then I guess the question, there was other things, but I suppose this evening we'll make a run for it unless anyone has final things to say. There is something that helps me with theme on this weird question, because like you've been pointing to, Mr. Luber, what is the theme has to unveil itself at the end, right? And yet there has to be a meaningful participation in it now, right? It is perhaps useful to think of theme not primarily as a verbal experience, but an aesthetic experience. Like the theme is not going to be a sentence, it's going to be a vision. The theme is going to be a surprise. It's going to be something you see. And I think for me, well, the theme that was always already in operating has something to do with the forms of all things formulating according to a metageometry that actually is for the subject that we don't experience because we don't let be. And thus we're constantly concealing it from ourselves. That there is something about how that tree there is itself that is actually unfolding in a manner that is isomorphic with all layers of reality, even though they're different in qualities, that has some sort of way that everything that happens to that tree is actually in favor of an experience of the beautiful, of the negentropic. And that even if it falls, that will nevertheless lend itself into at least the possibility of a memory that can be used as material for a story, where you could have that arrangement in the room with Alex like you were describing, and then it strikes with a care that changes your behavior going into the future that couldn't have happened if that tree didn't fall. And then you carry that tree with you into the other experiences. And if you have the memory and don't let it go of how the falling of that tree actually formulated you in a manner that could have that strike of care, you're able to hold the faith in that and have the courage for the next thing that will be required, so you can have that experience again and again. And then that may train you up to the ability to be able to hold to that memory when you're in the social with the person you disagree with or who annoys you. And then ultimately to the person that you consider an enemy. And the enemy is the hardest one of whom perhaps it is to, the hardest one before whom to hold that memory of how things unfold. And before whom it will seem most implausible that there is some sort of consistent form that is in all things, and before whom it would be most reasonable to believe it is not present. And that's precisely when, if you could let it be, that it could unveil yourself, and then you would be the kind of subject and virtue of whom is so able to live, and no one could take that from you. And I suppose that has something to do with the art of living, at least for me. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure. All the best to you.